Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Story 1. The factory loomed ahead, its rusted metal walls covered in patches of ivy and grime. Broken windows lined the upper floors, their jagged edges catching the fading sunlight. The massive doors hung slightly open, revealing a dark interior filled with the scent of oil and decay. The wind howled through the gaps, carrying with it the distant sound of something creaking inside. Stepping through the entrance, my boots crunched against shattered glass and loose debris. The air was thick with dust, swirling in the beams of light cutting through the broken ceiling. Conveyor belts sat motionless, their surfaces coated in rust and forgotten grime. Large machines stood like skeletal remains, their gears frozen in time, as if the factory had been abandoned in an instant. I moved deeper into the space, the silence pressing in on me. My footsteps echoed, bouncing off the walls and disappearing into the vast emptiness. A faint metallic smell lingered in the air, mixing with the dampness of old machinery. It felt as though I wasn't alone, as if the factory itself was breathing around me. A long workbench stretched along one wall, covered in tools scattered haphazardly across its surface. Wrenches, hammers, and screwdrivers lay untouched beneath a layer of dust. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the grit beneath my skin. Then, among the cold metal, I touched something that made me freeze. One of the tools, a heavy wrench, was warm. The warmth seeped into my fingers, unmistakable against the surrounding chill. My pulse quickened as I lifted it, turning it over in my hands. It wasn't just warm. It felt as though someone had just set it down. But the factory was supposed to be abandoned. I scanned the area, my breath slow and measured. There were no footprints in the dust, no signs of recent activity. Yet the warmth of the wrench told a different story. The longer I held it, the more uneasy I felt, as if I had interrupted something I wasn't supposed to witness. A sudden clatter broke the silence, making me whip around. A small metal can rolled across the floor, spinning before coming to a stop near one of the machines. My heart pounded as I searched for the source of the disturbance, but there was nothing. No movement, no shadow, just the empty, yawning space of the factory. The stillness was suffocating, every instinct telling me to leave. But curiosity pushed me forward, guiding me past rusted equipment and decaying pipes. The staircase led up to an office overlooking the factory floor, its glass windows cracked and grimy. The door hung slightly open, revealing a dimly lit space beyond. I stepped inside, the floor groaning under my weight. An old desk sat in the corner, covered in scattered papers and a thick layer of dust. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers partially open as if someone had rummaged through them. A single chair was pulled out, facing the desk as though someone had just been sitting there. My fingers brushed over the papers, revealing schematics and old production logs. Some of the pages were brittle, their edges curling with age. But then I noticed something strange, a fresh sheet of paper resting on top, its surface untouched by dust. I picked it up, my eyes narrowing at the writing scrawled across it. "Do not turn around." The word sent a sharp chill through me, my breath catching in my throat. My body tensed, every nerve on edge. The silence around me suddenly felt heavier, like something unseen was watching, waiting. My fingers clenched the paper, my mind racing. A sound behind me, a faint shuffle, barely audible. My muscles locked, my breath shallow. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to run, but my legs refused to obey. The air in the room grew colder, pressing against my skin like a suffocating weight. Slowly, I forced myself to turn, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The office was empty. No movement. No figure lurking in the shadows. Just the dim light filtering through the cracked windows, illuminating the dust floating in the air. But something had changed. The chair in front of the desk was no longer facing it. It was turned toward me. I stumbled back, my heartbeat deafening. The door to the office suddenly creaked, swinging inward as if inviting me deeper. The air felt charged, heavy with something unseen. I needed to leave. Now. Rushing down the stairs, I forced myself to keep my breathing steady. The factory floor stretched ahead, vast and unmoving. But as I reached the workbench again, something made me stop. The tools were no longer scattered. They were neatly arranged, perfectly lined up as if someone had carefully placed them there. The wrench I had picked up was gone. My stomach clenched as the factory suddenly felt too quiet. The silence wasn't just emptiness, it was expectant, like something was waiting for me to notice. A metallic clang echoed from the far end of the factory, deeper in the darkness. It wasn't random this time. It was deliberate. Calculated. Someone or something was still here. I turned toward the exit, my steps quick and purposeful. The factory had been abandoned for years, but I knew now that it wasn't empty. As I reached the massive doors, a soft voice whispered from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come." The words sent ice through my veins, my hands shaking as I shoved the doors open. Cold air rushed in, breaking the suffocating grip of the factory's presence. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. As I stepped outside, the wind howled through the broken windows, carrying the distant sound of something moving inside. The factory hadn't been abandoned, not really. And whatever was in there, it knew I had been there too. Story 2. The theater loomed at the end of the empty street, its grand entrance now cracked and weathered. The once vibrant marquee was missing letters, and vines curled through the broken windows. I hesitated at the doors, pressing my hand against the cool wood before giving them a push. They creaked open, revealing darkness beyond. Dust filled the air as I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing through the vast, empty lobby. The scent of mildew and aged velvet lingered, a reminder of the theater's forgotten past. Faint lights seeped through the boarded-up windows, casting long shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The silence was deep, the kind that settled in places untouched for years. I moved cautiously toward the main hall, my fingers brushing against the faded fabric of a velvet rope. The entrance to the theater itself was partially open, as if someone had been here recently. Pushing it wider, I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim glow filtering from the skylights above. The seats stretched out before me, rows upon rows of dust-covered chairs facing the massive stage. As I took a step forward, the stage lights flickered on, their beams cutting through the darkness like a spotlight. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the room, searching for an explanation. The electricity should have been long dead, yet the lights shone as if a performance was about to begin. A deep sense of unease settled in my chest. Then I saw it. At the very back of the theater, just beyond the final row of seats, a figure stood in the shadows. It was motionless, its form blending into the darkness, except for its outline. My skin prickled as I realized it was watching me, though I couldn't make out its features. A chill swept through the air, carrying with it the faintest whisper of movement. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. The figure remained still, unshaken by the sudden illumination. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the old architecture. But deep down, I knew better. The silence was suffocating, pressing against my ears like the weight of unseen eyes. For a moment I considered leaving, but curiosity rooted me in place. I stepped closer to the stage, my shoes stirring up dust from the red carpet. The wooden boards creaked under my weight as I ascended the stairs, standing under the glow of the flickering lights. The air felt different up here, heavier, as if the theater itself was holding its breath. A soft rustling came from the back of the hall, barely audible over the hum of the lights. My stomach tightened as I forced myself to look toward the figure again. It had moved. No longer standing at the back. It was closer now, just a few rows behind where I had been standing moments before. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out the rational thoughts in my mind. The seats groaned, as if unseen hands were pressing down on the aged cushions. One by one, the sounds moved toward me, each shift closing the distance. I took a step back, gripping the edge of the curtain as if it could offer some form of protection. The stage lights flickered again, casting the theater into brief darkness. When they flared back to life, the figure was even closer. Panic gripped me, my breath coming in short gasps. I turned toward the backstage area, hoping to find another way out. The heavy curtains swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. My heart pounded as I slipped between them, the darkness behind the stage swallowing me whole. The musty scent of old costumes and forgotten props filled my nose. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked open. The sound sent a jolt through me, my body frozen in place. I forced myself to move, pushing through the tangled ropes and rigging. My hands brushed against a wooden prop table, the objects on it shifting slightly under my touch. I needed to find an exit before whatever was in the theater found me first. The floorboards groaned behind me, slow and deliberate. My stomach twisted as I realized I wasn't alone back here. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes boring into my back, the same presence from the audience now just beyond the curtain. I bit my lip, resisting the urge to turn around. A whisper drifted through the air, low and unintelligible. It slithered into my ears like a breath against my skin. My fingers dug into the fabric of the curtain as I pressed myself against the wall. The lights on the stage flickered violently now, casting jagged shadows through the cracks in the fabric. Then, silence. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing. I hesitated before stepping forward, peeking through a small opening in the curtain. The theater was empty. The figure was gone. The seats remained undisturbed, as if nothing had ever happened. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing myself to move. I slipped back onto the stage, my legs trembling beneath me. The lights hummed overhead, their glow warm against my skin. My gaze swept over the theater, searching for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. A single seat in the front row was now occupied. The figure sat there, its form still and silent. Though I couldn't see its face, I knew it was looking directly at me. My blood ran cold as the lights overhead dimmed, plunging the theater into an eerie twilight. A quiet chuckle echoed through the hall, low and distant. The sound sent a shiver through me, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. The urge to run overwhelmed me, my body acting before my mind could catch up. I leapt from the stage, sprinting toward the exit. The theater seemed longer now, stretching endlessly before me. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound distorted as if the walls themselves were shifting. The heavy doors loomed ahead, but they felt impossibly far. I could still feel the weight of the figure's gaze, pressing into my back. Finally, I reached the doors, my hands fumbling against the cold metal handles. They wouldn't budge. My chest tightened as I threw my weight against them, desperate to escape. The laughter grew louder, surrounding me, filling every inch of the decayed theater. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The doors swung open without resistance, spilling me onto the cracked pavement outside. I gasped for air, my hands shaking as I pushed myself upright. The street was empty, the night eerily quiet. I turned back to the theater, my heart still pounding. The lights inside had gone dark, the windows reflecting only the emptiness beyond. But just before I looked away, I saw one seat near the front, illuminated by a single flickering bulb. It was no longer empty. Story 3. The mansion stood at the edge of town, hidden behind towering trees and a rusted iron gate. Its windows were dark, hollow sockets staring out at the world, the roof sagging under years of neglect. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, wrapping around the building like it was trying to pull it into the earth. Pushing open the front door, I stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of decay and forgotten time. The floor creaked beneath my weight, dust swirling in the dim light filtering through broken stained glass. Torn wallpaper curled at the edges, and cobwebs stretched across the corners like fragile veins. Furniture sat abandoned, covered in sheets that had turned yellow with age. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals coated in grime, swaying slightly in the breeze from the open door. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of something shifting deep within the house. I moved carefully through the foyer, my fingers grazing the wooden banister of a massive staircase. The railing was smooth but brittle, like it would snap under the wrong pressure. Faded portraits lined the walls, their subjects staring down at me with hollow, painted eyes. A doorway led me into what must have once been a study. The fireplace was cold, its brickwork crumbling, ashes long since settled into dust. Bookshelves stretched along the walls, their contents rotting, pages curled and browned with time. Then I saw a diary lying in the center of the floor, half covered in dust. Its leather cover was cracked, the spine barely holding together, as if it had been read and reread countless times. Something about it felt wrong, like it had been left there just for me to find. I knelt and brushed the dust away before carefully opening it. The pages inside were filled with frantic, slanted handwriting, words bleeding together as if written in a hurry. The first few entries were mundane, detailing the daily life of the mansion's last resident. As I flipped through, the tone shifted. The entries spoke of strange noises in the night, shadows moving where none should be. The writer described whispers coming from empty rooms, doors locking and unlocking on their own. Each page was more desperate than the last. My breath caught when I reached the final entry. Unlike the rest, the handwriting was jagged, uneven, as if written in terror. Only 2 words stared back at me, written in deep, dark ink. "You're next." A chill crawled up my spine as I reread the message, my pulse pounding in my ears. The ink looked fresher than it should have, the letters still bold despite the decay of the pages. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier, pressing down on me like an unseen weight. A noise behind me made me whip around. The study door, which had been open when I entered, was now closed. The handle gleamed in the dim light, as if someone had just touched it. My mouth went dry as I slowly rose to my feet. The house had been silent before, but now I could hear it breathing. The faintest rustling echoed from the hall, like footsteps moving just out of sight. Shadows stretched along the walls, shifting even though nothing had changed. Clutching the diary, I backed toward the fireplace, my gaze locked on the door. The air was thick, charged with something unseen but undeniably present. The temperature dropped, my breath now visible in thin, misty puffs. The chandelier above groaned, its rusted chain creaking as it swayed harder than before. Dust rained down in soft cascades, the crystals clinking together like distant chimes. My heartbeat thundered in my chest, every instinct telling me to leave. I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled, it remained locked in place, as though something on the other side was holding it shut. Panic clawed at my throat as I turned to find another way out. A mirror above the fireplace caught my reflection, but something was wrong. My reflection stood still, watching me even as I moved. My breath hitched as I took a slow step closer, my reflection's lips curling into a smile I hadn't made. A whisper brushed against my ear, so close that I could feel the breath behind it. My muscles locked, every hair on my body standing on end. The diary in my hands grew unbearably cold, the pages stiffening as though turning to ice. The chandelier above gave a violent jerk, the chain snapping with a sickening crack. I barely had time to throw myself aside as it crashed down, shattering into 1,000 shards. The impact sent a wave of dust into the air, obscuring everything in a choking cloud. Coughing, I scrambled to my feet, my eyes stinging. The diary lay open beside me, its pages fluttering as if caught in an unseen wind. The words "you're next" seemed to pulse on the page, growing darker, as though the ink was still seeping in. A deep, guttural sound filled the room, neither human nor animal. The shadows in the corners thickened, curling toward me like fingers reaching out. My chest tightened as I lunged for the door, throwing my weight against it. This time it gave way. I stumbled into the hallway, nearly falling as I rushed toward the front of the house. The walls groaned, the portraits lining them shifting in their frames, watching as I fled. The front door loomed ahead, but the moment I reached for the handle, a sharp gust of wind slammed it shut. A force pushed against my back, cold and unrelenting, urging me deeper into the mansion. My screams died in my throat as the darkness swallowed me whole. The diary remained where I had left it, its pages flipping on their own. The words on the final entry slowly faded, replaced by a new name scrawled in fresh ink. The mansion remained silent once more, waiting for the next visitor to step inside. 9. Story 4. The hospital loomed ahead, its crumbling facade barely visible through the thick mist that clung to the air. The windows were shattered, jagged glass framing the empty darkness beyond. Vines crept up the walls, weaving through the cracks as if trying to pull the building into the earth. The front doors hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze, an unspoken invitation to anyone foolish enough to enter. Stepping inside, I was greeted by the stench of mildew and decay. The floor was littered with debris, discarded papers, rusted medical tools, and dirt that had settled over years of abandonment. The long hallway stretched ahead, lined with peeling wallpaper and doors that barely clung to their hinges. A faint echo of my footsteps filled the air, making the emptiness feel heavier. As I walked deeper, the temperature dropped, the air thick with an unnatural chill. The remnants of the hospital's past lingered, faded posters reminding staff to wash their hands, an old wheelchair resting in the middle of the hallway, as if its occupant had simply vanished. The silence pressed in, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I turned a corner and found a door slightly ajar. The small metal plaque beside it was too rusted to read, but something about the room drew me in. Pushing the door open, I was met with darkness, the air heavier than before. The scent of old fabric and something faintly metallic lingered in the room. Stepping inside, my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the cracked window. Against the far wall, an old cot sat, its metal frame rusted but intact. The sheets were wrinkled, uneven, as if someone had just risen from them. The pillow, pressed into the mattress, held the imprint of a head. I hesitated, my pulse quickening as I stepped closer. Placing my hand on the pillow, I felt warmth, fresh, undeniable warmth. Someone had been here. Recently. The realization sent a wave of unease crawling up my spine. The building had been abandoned for decades. There shouldn't be anyone here. A creak echoed from the hallway, soft but distinct. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat. The door remained open, the darkness beyond seeming thicker, as if something lingered just out of sight. The silence that followed felt watchful, as though the hospital itself was waiting for my next move. I scanned the room, searching for any sign of who or what had been here. Beside the cot, a small table held a single item, an old medical chart. Its pages yellowed with age. My fingers trembled as I picked it up, the name at the top barely legible through the faded ink. My own. The chart slipped from my grasp, landing with a soft rustle against the floor. My chest tightened, my mind scrambling for a logical explanation. I had never been here before. This hospital had been abandoned long before I was even born, but the date on the last entry was today. A soft rustling sounded from the cot. My breath hitched as I turned back, my stomach twisting in cold dread. The sheets, undisturbed just moments ago, had shifted. The imprint in the pillow was gone. The warmth had vanished. A whisper of movement stirred the air behind me. The hairs on my neck rose, my body frozen in place. Slowly I turned, my gaze sweeping the room. Nothing. The doorway remained open, the hallway beyond silent. But the feeling of being watched was stronger now, pressing against my skin like an unseen force. I needed to leave. Now, my legs felt stiff as I stepped toward the door, forcing myself to move. As I reached the hallway, a flickering light caught my eye. Further down, an old nurse's station stood, its monitors long dead, but one of them now glowed faintly. Against my better judgment, I approached. The screen buzzed with static, the faint outline of a figure barely visible through the interference. My fingers hovered over the dusty keyboard, uncertain. Then, in a sudden burst, the screen cleared. A live feed. The camera was pointed at the room I had just left. The cot was empty, but the sheets moved. An invisible weight pressed into them, indentations forming as though something or someone was lying down again. My breath shuddered as the screen flickered once more. Then the camera angle shifted. It was no longer focused on the cot. It was pointed at me. A sharp clatter behind me sent me spinning around. The hallway was empty, but the air had changed. It felt heavier, charged with something unseen. The overhead lights, long dead, flickered once before plunging everything into deeper darkness. I backed away, my hands trembling as I turned toward the exit. The silence stretched, unbroken, until a sound cut through its soft, rhythmic breathing. Not my own. It was coming from the room. I forced myself to move, my footsteps quickening as I made my way toward the entrance. The hallway stretched longer than before, the walls pressing in, as though the building itself was shifting around me. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. The doors loomed ahead, just within reach. I lunged forward, my hands gripping the cold metal. But as I pushed, they wouldn't budge. The air around me thickened, growing suffocating. The breathing was closer now, just behind me. A hand brushed my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing. Only the empty hallway stretching endlessly into darkness. The hospital was silent again, but something had changed. The walls seemed closer, the air colder, the presence heavier. With one final shove, the doors gave way, spilling me into the night. The cold air hit my face, sharp and real. My chest heaved as I stumbled forward, putting as much distance between me and the hospital as possible. Turning back, I expected to see the building standing in eerie silence, but the entrance was shut, sealed as if it had never been open. The windows, dark and empty, revealed nothing within. As I stood there, trying to slow my racing heart, a flicker of movement caught my eye. One of the second-floor windows. A shape stood there, barely visible through the grime-covered glass, watching. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and left, the night swallowing the hospital behind me. But even as I walked away, I could still feel it. The weight of unseen eyes, the lingering warmth of a place long abandoned, and the knowledge that something or someone had been expecting me. Story 5. The school stood at the edge of town, forgotten and crumbling with time. The windows were shattered, leaving jagged edges that framed the hollow darkness inside. The doors hung open, creaking slightly in the wind, as if welcoming anyone foolish enough to enter. The air smelled of dust and decay, the scent of neglect thick and cloying. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Lockers lined the walls, their metal doors rusted and dented from years of exposure. Some stood ajar, revealing old textbooks and torn papers left behind by students who never returned. A faint draft moved through the corridor, carrying with it the scent of something stale and long forgotten. The overhead lights were shattered, leaving only streaks of moonlight filtering through the broken windows. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the peeling paint and curling posters clinging stubbornly to the walls. A faint scrawling of graffiti covered parts of the hallway, names and symbols blending together in a chaotic mess. The silence was heavy, pressing against me like an unseen weight. I moved deeper into the school, drawn by an uneasy curiosity. The classrooms stood open, their desks coated in thick layers of dust. Some chairs were toppled over, as if left in a hurry, while others remained perfectly in place, waiting for students who would never return. The air felt different here, thick with something I couldn't name. One particular classroom caught my attention. The door was slightly ajar, the hinges rusted but intact. I pushed it open, the creak echoing through the empty space. Inside, the desks were arranged neatly, as if a lesson had just ended. The blackboard at the front of the room held a message written in bold, uneven strokes. "Leave now, before it's too late." The words were fresh, the chalk still clinging to the board in powdery streaks. My stomach tightened as I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The message hadn't been there long, someone had written it recently. I scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. I turned toward the door, suddenly aware of how still everything had become. The air no longer carried the faint sounds of the wind outside. Even the distant groan of the building settling had ceased. It was as if the school itself was holding its breath. A chill crawled up my spine, making my skin prickle. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. The message on the blackboard felt like a warning, one I was beginning to take seriously. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to turn around and never come back. But something about the classroom felt unfinished, as if there was more I needed to see. A faint shuffle sounded behind me. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping over the empty desks. Nothing had moved, but the air was different now, charged with something unseen. The door, which had been open, was now almost completely shut. A tight knot formed in my stomach as I forced myself to breathe. I walked toward the door, reaching out to push it open. The moment my fingers touched the wood, a sound echoed through the room, a whisper, faint and distant. It wasn't coming from the hallway or the outside. It was inside the classroom with me. My fingers tightened around the doorknob, the metal ice cold beneath my touch. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices murmuring just beyond my understanding. The words twisted and curled, spoken in a cadence that sent chills down my spine. My pulse pounded as I yanked the door open, stepping hurriedly into the hallway. The moment I did, the whispering stopped. The silence was absolute, the air thick with an oppressive weight. I turned, my flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. The classroom was exactly as I had left it. The desks remained untouched, the chalkboard unchanged. But something felt different, something I couldn't explain. The school felt more alive now, as if it had been waiting for me to listen. I forced my feet to move, hurrying down the hall toward the exit. My breath was unsteady, my chest tight with unease. The corridors stretched endlessly before me, every shadow seeming deeper, darker than before. The sound of my footsteps echoed unnaturally, doubling back as if someone was following just a step behind. As I reached the main entrance, a loud crash sounded from somewhere deep within the school. The noise reverberated through the walls, shaking the dust from the ceiling. I froze, my heart pounding against my ribs. It had come from the classroom. Something or someone was still in there. I didn't wait to find out. I sprinted toward the open doorway, my breath sharp and uneven. The cold night air hit me like a wall as I stumbled outside, my legs unsteady beneath me. The school loomed behind me, dark and silent once more, as if it had never stirred at all. I turned back one last time, my flashlight illuminating the entrance. For a moment, I saw nothing but the empty doorway and the hollow halls beyond. Then, just as I was about to step away, I saw it. A figure stood in the darkness, barely visible, watching me from within the school. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply stood there, as if waiting for me to return. My breath caught in my throat, my body frozen in place. The figure was too still, too perfectly outlined against the shadows. I knew without a doubt that it had been watching me the entire time. I turned and walked away, my steps quick but controlled. I didn't run, didn't look back again. The air around me felt thick, as if something unseen was following just out of reach. The night was cold, the stars distant and indifferent. I could still hear the whispering, faint and fading, carried on the wind. Story 6. The amusement park had been abandoned for years, its entrance hidden behind rusted gates and overgrown vines. Faded banners flapped weakly in the breeze, their once bright colors now dull and lifeless. The air smelled of damp wood, rust, and something faintly sweet, like old cotton candy left to rot. My footsteps echoed against cracked pavement as I made my way inside. Broken rides stood like skeletal remains, their frames twisted and hollow. A Ferris wheel loomed overhead, its rusted gondolas swaying slightly in the wind. The roller coaster tracks stretched into the distance, disappearing into the thick fog that clung to the park. Everything was still, frozen in time, except for the soft creak of metal shifting in the silence. Then I heard it. A faint melody drifted through the air, slow and haunting. My chest tightened as I followed the sound, weaving between toppled booths and shattered glass. It grew louder as I approached the center of the park, where a carousel stood beneath a collapsing canopy. The ride was still turning, its platform groaning as it spun ever so slowly. The horses were faded and cracked, their paint peeling away in long curling strips. Some had missing eyes, their sockets hollow and dark. Chains dangled where other animals had once been, swaying in rhythm with the motion. The calliope played on, though its notes warbled, distorted by time and decay. I hesitated at the edge of the platform, my pulse thrumming in my ears. The carousel shouldn't have been moving. There was no power, no sign of life anywhere. Yet the ride continued, steady and unbothered by the years of neglect. A cold breeze brushed against my neck, sending a shiver down my spine. My eyes darted around the park, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing, just the empty stalls, the broken rides, and the slow turn of the carousel. I stepped closer, drawn in despite the unease curling in my gut. My fingers grazed the chipped paint of one of the horses, the surface rough and splintered. As I touched it, the carousel gave a sudden, lurching jolt. The music skipped, distorting into something shrill and wrong before settling back into its slow, eerie tune. I pulled my hand back, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes scanned the ride, tracing each of the figures mounted on its platform. Most were empty, their leather straps frayed and broken. But then, I saw it. A single horse near the center was occupied. A figure sat atop it, unmoving, their posture stiff and unnatural. Their clothes were old, out of place, something from decades ago. A tattered coat draped over their hunched frame, the edges fluttering slightly in the wind. Their hands rested on the carved pole, fingers too long and thin. I swallowed hard, my body screaming for me to leave, but my feet refused to move. My gaze lifted slowly to their face, expecting dust and decay. Instead, I was met with a pair of wide, unblinking eyes staring directly at me. My breath hitched as the figure's lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile. The carousel continued to turn, carrying them past me in its endless rotation. My legs finally obeyed, stepping backward off the platform. The figure didn't move, didn't shift, only watched as the ride spun on. The music faltered again, its melody stretching, warping into something almost like laughter. The air around me thickened, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. Then the carousel slowed. The grinding of gears filled the air as the ride crept to a stop. The music cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing. The figure on the horse was still there, but their head had turned slightly, as if they had followed my movement. I took another step back, my limbs trembling. The silence was unbearable, pressing in from all sides. I needed to go, now. As I turned to leave, the ride let out a long, drawn-out groan. The platform shuddered beneath the weight of something unseen. I risked a final glance over my shoulder. The figure was gone. The horse they had occupied sat empty, its saddle cracked and worn. My stomach lurched as I scanned the area, searching the shadows. There was nowhere for them to go, nowhere to hide. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the park, carrying with it a whisper. It was soft, barely audible, but it came from directly behind me. "Stay." I didn't. I ran, pushing past debris and rusted gates, my breath coming in sharp, panic gasps. The park stretched endlessly around me, the pathways unfamiliar in my blind panic. The whisper followed, weaving through the air like smoke, curling around my ears. "Stay." My legs burned as I pushed forward, the entrance finally coming into view. I didn't stop, didn't look back. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air shifted. The wind stopped. The sound vanished. The amusement park stood silent behind me, its shadows deeper than before. The carousel was no longer moving. The music had died. It was as if nothing had ever stirred within those broken walls. I backed away, my body trembling. My mind screamed for me to leave and never return. But even as I turned my back on the park, I knew it wasn't over. The whisper still lingered, just beneath the wind. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against my spine. And deep within the heart of the forgotten amusement park, the carousel would start turning again. Story 7. The zoo had been abandoned for years, its once vibrant pathways now overgrown with weeds and cracked pavement. The entrance gate hung open, rusted hinges groaning as the wind nudged it back and forth. Faded signs remained, their words barely legible, warning visitors not to feed the animals. The air carried the scent of damp earth and decay, the remnants of a place long forgotten. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled by scattered leaves and debris. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the occasional rustling of trees or the distant call of a bird. Empty cages lined the pathways, their bars rusted, the enclosures within overtaken by nature. Some still held remnants of their former inhabitants, weathered bones, abandoned nests, and deep claw marks etched into the walls. A towering habitat stood before me, its metal fencing bent in places, as if something had forced its way out. The sign nearby had peeled beyond recognition, only a few letters visible beneath the layers of dirt. I ran my fingers over the rusted gate, feeling the weight of time pressing against it. It swung open with little resistance, revealing a narrow tunnel that led into the heart of the enclosure. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp stone and rotting leaves. The walls were high, surrounding the space like a prison, their surfaces slick with moisture. Old feeding troughs sat empty, their contents long turned to dust. A tattered rope toy lay discarded in the dirt, frayed and worn from time and neglect. Then I heard footsteps. They were close, too close to be my own. My breath hitched as I turned, expecting to see someone standing behind me. But the enclosure was empty, the only movement coming from the swaying branches above. My pulse quickened, the echo of each step lingering in my ears. The air around me seemed to shift, growing heavier with an unseen presence. I moved toward the gate, gripping its bars with clammy hands, but it wouldn't budge. Rust flaked beneath my fingertips as I rattled it, my heartbeat pounding in my chest. A chill crept along my spine as the footsteps sounded again, slow and deliberate, circling the space around me. Each step crunched against the dirt, stopping just beyond my line of sight. A low creak echoed through the enclosure, the sound of something shifting in the shadows. My breath came shallow as I scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement. The dim light cast long, distorted shadows along the walls, twisting with the breeze. The footsteps started again, this time moving closer, the rhythm steady and unhurried. I turned sharply, expecting to see a figure emerge from the gloom, but the space remained empty. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I swallowed hard, my fingers curling into fists as I forced myself to remain still. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves, but I knew I wasn't alone. A metallic clang rang out behind me, sharp and sudden, sending a jolt of fear through my chest. I spun around, my pulse hammering as I searched for the source. A rusted chain swung gently from the fence, swaying as if something had just brushed against it. My skin prickled, the sensation of unseen eyes watching me settling deep in my bones. The air grew colder, each breath I took visible in the dim light. The enclosure felt smaller now, the walls seeming to press inward as the silence stretched. A shadow flickered in the corner of my vision, disappearing the moment I turned my head. My body tensed, every nerve on edge, as the footsteps resumed, this time directly behind me. I didn't look back. Instead, I grabbed the gate again, yanking with all my strength. The metal groaned in protest, resisting my attempts to force it open. The footsteps stopped just inches away, the presence behind me so close I could feel the air shift. A whisper of breath ghosted against the back of my neck, sending a shudder through my body. Then, the gate gave way. I stumbled forward, nearly falling onto the cracked pavement outside. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned back, expecting to see someone standing there. But the enclosure was empty, the dirt undisturbed except for my own footprints. The shadows remained still, the silence unbroken. The chain that had swung moments before now hung motionless, as if nothing had touched it. My mind reeled, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. I took a step back, unwilling to turn away from the enclosure just yet. A part of me expected to see a figure appear, something emerging from the darkness. But nothing came. The zoo stretched around me, its empty pathways winding deeper into the forgotten landscape. The air still carried that unnatural chill, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against my back. I knew I should leave, that I had already stayed too long. Yet something kept me rooted to the spot, the lingering question of what had been in that enclosure gnawing at my mind. Then, from deep within the zoo, the sound of footsteps echoed once more. Story 8. The mansion stood at the end of a forgotten path, its towering frame hidden beneath layers of creeping vines and overgrown trees. The windows were dark, their glass cracked and clouded with dust. The air smelled of damp wood and earth, a sign that time had long since swallowed this place whole. Yet something about it drew me in, an unshakable pull I couldn't ignore. Pushing open the heavy front doors, I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, its floral patterns peeling at the edges. A grand staircase stretched upward, its once polished wood now dull and coated in dust. Cobwebs hung in the corners, swaying slightly in the still air, as if disturbed by an unseen presence. Moving deeper into the mansion, I found a hallway filled with closed doors, their brass handles tarnished with age. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on me with each step I took. A strange feeling settled in my chest, like I had entered a place that didn't want to be disturbed. The shadows along the walls seemed to stretch unnaturally, shifting even when I wasn't moving. One door at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking through the gap. Something about it sent a chill through me, but I reached out and pushed it open. The room beyond was filled with old furniture, antique chairs, wooden tables, and bookshelves lined with dusty tomes. The scent of aged paper and forgotten memories lingered in the air. In the center of the room, a single chair rocked slowly back and forth, its creaking sound the only noise in the otherwise silent space. There was no wind, no draft, nothing to explain why it was moving. My breath hitched as I stared, watching the rhythmic motion, steady and deliberate. It was as if something unseen had just risen from it, leaving behind only the echo of its presence. I stepped forward hesitantly, my heart beat loud in my ears. The chair continued its slow movement, untouched by any visible force. The floor beneath it was layered with dust, yet the space directly beneath the chair was oddly clear. It was as if someone or something had been sitting there only moments ago. The air around it felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't understand. A cold breeze brushed against my skin, though the air in the room was still. The door behind me let out a quiet creak, as if nudged by unseen hands. My instincts screamed for me to leave, but my feet remained rooted in place. There was something here, something waiting. I could feel it watching, its gaze heavy and unwavering. I reached for the chair, my fingers trembling as they hovered above the wooden armrest. The moment my hand came close, the rocking slowed until it stopped entirely. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing into my ears like a suffocating weight. I pulled my hand back, a shiver running down my spine. The air had shifted, as if the room itself was holding its breath. A sudden knock echoed from the hallway, sharp and deliberate. My head snapped toward the door, my stomach twisting in fear. The hallway beyond was empty, but the sound had been real, unmistakable. It was a warning, a message from something unseen. I wasn't alone in the mansion. The floor groaned behind me, the sound of weight shifting across the wooden planks. I turned back quickly, my eyes darting around the room. Nothing had moved, yet the space felt different, as if something had rearranged itself in the blink of an eye. The chair remained still, but the air around it seemed heavier, darker. It was as if something lingered just beyond my vision, waiting for me to notice. My pulse pounded as I backed toward the door, my instincts finally overpowering my curiosity. Another knock sounded, this time closer, just outside the room. The shadows in the corners deepened, stretching toward me like reaching fingers. I couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever was in this house didn't want me here. I turned and rushed into the hallway, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The air was colder now, the temperature dropping with each step I took. The walls seemed narrower, the hallway stretching endlessly ahead of me. No matter how fast I moved, the exit felt impossibly far away, as if the mansion itself was pulling me deeper inside. A whisper brushed against my ear, so close it sent an icy jolt through my entire body. It was faint, almost unintelligible, but the message was clear. Leave. The voice was neither angry nor pleading, it was simply stating a fact. I didn't belong here. The moment I reached the grand staircase, the heavy front doors let out a deep, groaning creak. My heart slammed against my ribs as I saw them inching open, revealing the dark night beyond. It was as if the house itself was giving me one final chance to escape. I didn't hesitate. I rushed forward, practically throwing myself through the doorway and onto the overgrown path outside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air lightened, the oppressive weight lifting from my chest. Behind me, the mansion stood silent once more, its windows dark and lifeless. The doors had closed again, sealing whatever remained inside. I stumbled back, my breath shaky as I stared up at the towering structure. The rocking chair, the whispers, the unseen presence. I hadn't imagined any of it. Something had been in there, something old, something that had waited for far too long. And for a moment, it had acknowledged me. As I turned to leave, I caught one last glimpse of the upstairs window. A shadow stood there, motionless, watching. It didn't move, didn't wave, didn't beckon me back. It simply observed, waiting in the darkness. The mansion had let me go this time, but somehow I knew it wasn't finished with me yet. Story 9. The firehouse stood at the end of an abandoned street, its brick exterior worn and cracked from years of neglect. The large garage doors were slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. A faint, acrid scent lingered in the air, a mix of smoke and something metallic. The silence was unsettling, the kind that made my skin crawl as I stepped inside. The garage was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering weakly as if struggling to stay alive. Dust coated the floor in thick layers, except for a single set of footprints leading toward the center of the space. My eyes locked onto the massive fire truck parked in the middle, its red paint dulled by time. But what made my stomach drop was the low hum of an engine running. The truck's headlights were off, but the faint vibration beneath my feet told me it was alive. A slow, rhythmic purr filled the air, steady and unnatural in the stillness. I hesitated, my pulse hammering against my ribs as I stepped closer. There was no sign of anyone inside, no movement, no voices, just the mechanical heartbeat of an empty machine. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the driver's side door. It was slightly ajar, as if someone had stepped out moments before I arrived. My reflection in the side mirror looked distorted, stretched unnaturally in the dim light. A sharp chill ran down my spine as I pulled the door open. The driver's seat was empty, but the keys were in the ignition, turned just enough to keep the engine running. A faint smell of burnt rubber clung to the interior, along with something else, something faintly sweet, like decayed wood. The dashboard lights flickered, casting brief flashes of red and green against the darkened interior. A radio sat on the console, its speaker crackling with static. I leaned in, hesitating before reaching for the dial. The moment my fingers brushed it, the static cut out. A voice, distorted and low, whispered through the speaker. It was garbled, the words impossible to understand, but the tone sent ice through my veins. I pulled back, my breath uneven as the voice continued, rising in urgency. The truck shuddered slightly, as if reacting to the sound. I slammed the door shut, my instincts screaming for me to leave. But something in me refused to turn away just yet. The firehouse had 2 levels, the second floor barely visible through the dust-covered glass of the garage windows. A staircase led up to the living quarters, where firefighters once waited for alarms that would never come again. I swallowed hard, forcing my feet forward as I climbed the steps. The upstairs was eerily intact, as if frozen in time. Beds were still made, dusty sheets stretched tightly over thin mattresses. Lockers stood open, some containing folded uniforms that had long since faded. A single light flickered in the hallway, its dim glow casting long shadows against the peeling walls. At the end of the corridor, a door stood slightly ajar. The brass handle was smeared with something dark, a stain that had seeped into the wood. My stomach twisted as I pushed the door open. Inside was a small office, its desk cluttered with scattered reports and an overturned coffee cup. But what caught my eye was the black and white photograph pinned to the wall. It was of a fire crew, 6 men standing proudly in front of the very truck sitting downstairs. Their expressions were solemn, their uniforms crisp and unstained. But something was off. The last man on the right, his face was blurred, as if the photograph had been damaged. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, my fingers brushing against the edges of the frame. A deep, distant sound rumbled through the building. At first, I thought it was thunder, but it was too steady, too rhythmic. It was coming from below. I turned sharply, my breath catching as the radio in the office crackled to life. The same garbled voice whispered again, clearer this time. It was calling a name. My name. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair as the voice faded into static. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out before whatever was happening reached me. I rushed down the stairs, my footsteps echoing loudly against the hollow walls. But as I reached the garage, I skidded to a halt. The fire truck's headlights were on now, casting twin beams of harsh white light through the darkness. The driver's door hung open, swaying slightly as if someone had just stepped out. The engine's purr had deepened, a slow, deliberate rumble that sent vibrations through the floor. A shadow moved behind the truck, a tall figure barely visible in the dim light. My throat tightened as I took a step back, my pulse slamming against my ribs. The air was thick, pressing down on me like a weight. The figure didn't move toward me, didn't make a sound, it only stood there, watching. The radio in the truck crackled again, the voice now clearer than before. "He's still here," it whispered, the words sharp and cold. My blood turned to ice as the figure behind the truck finally stepped forward. The overhead lights flickered wildly, plunging the garage into flashes of darkness and light. I could barely make out the man's face, if it was a man at all. His features were stretched, hollow, his eyes deep voids that reflected nothing. He took another step forward, the heavy weight of his presence crushing the air around me. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. My legs finally obeyed me, and I turned, sprinting toward the exit. The firehouse groaned around me, the truck's headlights flaring brighter as the engine roared. Just as I reached the doors, the sound of footsteps thundered behind me, too fast, too close. I burst outside into the night, the cold air slicing through my lungs. The street was empty, the firehouse looming behind me like a gaping wound in the darkness. I didn't stop running until I was blocks away, my legs burning, my heart threatening to explode. When I finally dared to look back, the firehouse was dark again. The headlights were gone, the engine silent. The street was just as lifeless as it had been when I arrived. But as I stood there, catching my breath, I heard one last sound, faint, almost lost in the wind. The low, steady hum of an engine, still running somewhere inside. Story 10. The hotel stood in eerie silence, its once grand exterior now crumbling under years of neglect. Ivy crawled up the walls, gripping the structure like nature's slow revenge. The broken windows gaped like hollow eyes, watching as I hesitated at the entrance. A faded sign above the doorway bore a name too weathered to read. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled by the dust-coated carpet. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, carrying a lingering trace of something unidentifiable. The grand chandelier above me swayed slightly, its crystals dulled and coated in grime. The vast lobby stretched before me, frozen in time as if waiting for guests who would never return. Beyond the check-in desk, a long hallway stretched into darkness, lined with closed doors. The air grew colder as I walked forward, my shoes scuffing against warped floorboards. The silence was unsettling, amplifying the sound of my own breathing. A faint draft moved through the corridor, stirring the dust in lazy swirls. One door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway. I froze, my breath hitching as a soft sound reached my ears. It was slow and deliberate breathing, steady and deep. The sound sent a chill through me, a stark reminder that I was not alone. I took a hesitant step forward, my pulse hammering in my ears. The breathing continued, unbroken, as though whoever was inside was aware of my presence. My fingers hovered over the edge of the door, but a deep instinct warned me not to push it open. The air in the hallway thickened, pressing against me like an unseen weight. A floorboard creaked somewhere down the hall, sharp and sudden. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor, but nothing moved. The walls felt closer than before, the air stifling as though the building itself was closing in. A cold sweat formed on the back of my neck as the breathing behind the door deepened. I forced myself to take a step back, every nerve in my body screaming to leave. My heartbeat thudded against my ribs as I turned away, determined to retrace my steps. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered, the shadows pooling in unnatural ways. A heavy silence pressed down, as if the walls were listening. Another door clicked open somewhere further down the hall, the sound barely audible but unmistakable. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep moving, though my legs felt heavy. My fingers grazed the peeling wallpaper, grounding myself in the reality of the moment. The breathing behind the door had stopped. A new sound filled the space, a faint shuffling, slow and dragging. My stomach twisted as I realized it was coming from the room I had just passed. The soft, rhythmic movement sent an unnatural chill through me, something calculated in its approach. I didn't dare turn around. The exit seemed impossibly far, the dim light from the lobby barely visible. My feet moved faster, each step an act of sheer will. The shuffling grew louder, closing the distance with a deliberate slowness. A whisper of air brushed the back of my neck, impossibly close. I lunged forward, bursting into the lobby with a force that sent dust swirling in the stale air. The chandelier above groaned, its rusted chains shifting as if disturbed by an unseen force. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned back toward the hallway. The door that had been ajar was now fully open. Darkness yawned from the room, thick and impenetrable. The hallway seemed unchanged, yet something about it felt wrong. The breathing had stopped, the shuffling had ceased, but the air carried the unmistakable weight of something watching. I took a slow step back, unwilling to linger any longer. The front doors loomed before me, coated in dust yet strangely solid. My fingers fumbled against the handle, slick with sweat, as I pushed. The door resisted at first, as if something pressed against the other side. A sharp gust of wind howled through the broken windows, rattling the walls. With one final shove, the door gave way, spilling me onto the cracked pavement outside. The night air hit me in a rush, sharp and cold against my skin. I stumbled back, my gaze locked on the darkened entrance of the hotel. The silence stretched on, heavy with unspoken warnings. A slow creak echoed from within, the sound of the door swinging shut on its own. The night pressed in around me, thick with an unnatural stillness. My breath remained uneven as I backed away, unwilling to turn my back on the building. The last thing I saw before stepping off the curb was that same door, slightly ajar once more. A deep, slow breath drifted out from the darkness beyond it. Story 11. The abandoned school stood at the edge of town, its windows shattered and its walls streaked with years of neglect. Vines crawled up the sides of the building, their tendrils reaching through the cracks like fingers searching for something lost. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and dust, the silence pressing against my ears as I stepped inside. The hallway stretched before me, lined with faded lockers that bore the scars of rust and time. Some were slightly open, revealing tattered books and forgotten papers, their ink smudged by moisture. My footsteps echoed softly as I moved past classroom doors, their glass panels smeared with grime. One door stood ajar, its hinges creaking as I pushed it open further. Inside, rows of desks sat in eerie stillness, their surfaces layered in dust. The chalkboard at the front of the room was streaked with faded writing, the last remnants of a long-forgotten lesson. As I stepped deeper into the room, my fingers brushed over the desks, leaving clean streaks in the dust. Most were untouched for years, but one caught my eye immediately. There, on its surface, was a single fresh pencil mark, distinct against the filth surrounding it. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. Someone had been here recently, though there was no sign of another person. The silence pressed in heavier now, the room feeling smaller, as if watching me in return. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal, just a blank screen staring back at me. My fingers traced the pencil mark, its edges sharp and fresh, as if left there only moments ago. I looked around again, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was nothing. The air felt colder, the kind of chill that wasn't just from the weather but something unseen. I turned toward the windows, their glass long gone, only to see the trees outside swaying gently. For a moment I thought I saw a shadow move among them, but when I blinked, it was gone. I turned back to the desk, my pulse quickening as I noticed something I hadn't before. Faint words had been carved into the wood beneath the fresh pencil mark, their edges worn yet still legible. "Help me," they read, the letters uneven and desperate. A breath hitched in my throat as I stepped back, the weight of the message pressing into my chest. Had someone been trapped here? Had they tried to leave a sign for someone to find? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. The faint sound of something moving echoed from the hallway, breaking the heavy silence. My head snapped toward the door, but there was nothing there. The noise had been subtle, like a soft scrape against the floor, but enough to send my pulse hammering. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move toward the doorway. Peering into the hallway, I saw only dust and decay, the lockers still standing in their quiet disarray. Yet the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone clung to me like a shadow. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the hallway, rattling the doors and stirring the dust into swirling patterns. My heart pounded as I turned back into the classroom, my eyes drawn once more to the desk. The fresh pencil mark was gone. I froze, my breath shallow as I stared at the blank space where it had been. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but none came. The message carved into the desk remained, as if mocking my confusion, its plea now feeling more urgent. The scrape sounded again, closer this time, and I felt an overwhelming need to leave. My instincts screamed at me, my body tensing as I turned toward the door. Yet, something made me hesitate, a lingering curiosity gnawing at the edge of my fear. I glanced one last time at the desk, the weight of the words pressing into my mind. Then, with a deep breath, I stepped into the hallway, my eyes scanning the shadows stretching across the floor. The air was still now, thick with an unsettling quiet. As I moved toward the exit, I heard it a whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. My name. It was barely more than a breath, carried on the stale air, but it was enough to send a shiver through me. My pace quickened, my footsteps almost frantic. I reached the front doors, my fingers trembling as I pushed them open. The outside air felt sharp against my skin, the evening sun dipping below the trees. As I stepped onto the overgrown path, I turned back once more, my stomach twisting at what I saw. A single desk was now visible through the open classroom door, pushed forward as if someone had been sitting there. The dust that had covered it before was disturbed, smeared by unseen hands. I didn't wait to see more. I walked faster, my breath coming in short bursts as the school loomed behind me. The wind rustled the leaves overhead, whispering through the trees like unseen voices. I forced myself not to look back again, the feeling of unseen eyes lingering on my skin. By the time I reached the road, the sky had darkened, and the school had disappeared behind the trees. My hand still trembled as I pulled out my phone again, relief washing over me when the signal returned. But the unease remained, deep and unshakable. That night I couldn't sleep, my mind replaying every moment inside that school. The whisper of my name, the fresh pencil mark vanishing before my eyes, the message carved into the desk. My thoughts churned with questions that had no answers. The next morning I convinced myself it had all been in my head, just an overactive imagination in a place filled with ghosts of the past. Yet, as I reached for my jacket, my stomach dropped. A single pencil mark was on my sleeve, fresh and unmistakable. Story 12. The hospital had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, and its walls covered in creeping vines. The air inside was thick with dust, carrying the scent of decay and old medicine. My footsteps echoed down the empty hallway, each one making me feel more like an intruder in a place long forgotten. Faded posters clung to the peeling walls, their messages of health and safety now ironic in this hollow shell of a building. Rusted gurneys sat motionless in corners, their wheels locked in place by time. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling around me. I turned a corner and saw the elevator at the end of the hallway, its metal doors dull and speckled with rust. The call button was coated in grime, but I wiped it clean and pressed it anyway. To my surprise, the button lit up, casting an eerie glow against the decay. A deep groan rumbled from behind the doors, followed by a series of mechanical clicks. I took a step back, unsure if I had just woken something best left alone. Then, with a sharp ding, the doors slid open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The walls inside were lined with tarnished mirrors, their surfaces warped and clouded. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting unsteady shadows. The buttons on the panel were cracked, some missing entirely, but the basement level was still intact. I hesitated before stepping inside, the air in the elevator thick and musty. The doors remained open as if waiting for me to decide. A cold draft curled around my ankles, sending a shiver up my spine. Swallowing my unease, I pressed the button for the basement, and the doors groaned as they closed. The elevator shuddered violently, then lurched downward, the cables groaning under its weight. Dust drifted from the ceiling as the old mechanism struggled to function. For a few moments, everything was still except for the dim flickering of the light. Then the elevator stopped abruptly, but the doors did not open. I reached for the button panel, but before I could press anything, the light above me died, plunging the small space into darkness. The silence pressed in, heavier than before, thick with something unseen. My breathing sounded too loud in the confined space, and I strained to hear any movement beyond the doors. The sudden scrape against the metal made my heart pound. I pressed my back against the wall, my fingers finding the cool surface of the mirror. Another scrape came, followed by a faint tapping. It wasn't coming from outside the elevator, it was coming from within. My pulse pounded as I turned, my reflection barely visible in the dim glow of the emergency light. But as I stared, something shifted. The reflection of my own face twisted, the features distorting as if submerged in water. I stumbled backward, my hand slamming against the buttons, desperate to make the doors open. The elevator jolted violently, and for a moment I thought it might drop. Then, with a slow groan, the doors slid apart. A cold, stale air seeped into the elevator, carrying the scent of damp earth. The basement was pitch black, its darkness swallowing the dim light from the elevator. I stepped forward cautiously, my foot meeting solid ground. The hallway stretched into the abyss, the walls lined with broken wheelchairs and toppled cabinets. Old medical equipment lay discarded, their surfaces covered in grime. A faint sound echoed through the darkness, the soft shuffling of something moving. I took a slow step forward, the air growing colder with each movement. The silence between the sounds stretched unbearably, my heartbeat the only thing steady. Then, from deeper in the hallway, a faint voice whispered my name. I froze, every muscle locking in place. The voice was soft, distant, but unmistakable. It sounded like my own. A flickering light sputtered on further down the hall, revealing a doorway with an old, rusted sign. The words had faded, but I could still make them out, Morgie. The whisper came again, closer this time. I turned back toward the elevator, but the doors had closed. The call button was dark, unresponsive no matter how many times I pressed it. My breath came in uneven gasps as the whispering grew louder. Shadows slithered across the floor, stretching toward me as if reaching out. My feet felt rooted in place, my body refusing to move. Then, from the darkness beyond the moored doors, something stepped forward. It had no distinct features, only a tall, wavering form, its edges blurred like smoke. The whispering surrounded me, dozens of voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones. My limbs finally obeyed, and I turned, slamming my fists against the elevator doors. A low creak came from behind me as the moored doors began to open. The air grew thick, pressing against my chest like unseen hands. I clawed at the elevator panel, pressing every button in blind desperation. The elevator let out a shuddering groan. Then the doors slid open once more. I lunged inside, slamming my hand against the highest floor button. As the doors closed, I caught a final glimpse of the figure standing at the threshold. Its head tilted slightly, its form flickering like a dying light. The whispering ceased all at once, replaced by a suffocating silence. Then the doors sealed shut, and the elevator shot upward. The ascent was rough, the elevator rattling as if shaking off the weight of whatever had tried to follow. When it finally stopped, I practically fell out into the decayed hallway. The air here was stale, but at least it was familiar. I turned back toward the elevator, but the doors were already rusted shut again, as if they had never opened at all. The call button was dark, coated in grime just like before. It was as if nothing had happened. A gust of wind blew through the broken windows, carrying the scent of rain. My legs felt weak as I stumbled back toward the exit, each step slower than the last. But just as I reached the front doors, something made me stop. A faint whisper drifted through the empty corridor, echoing from the depths of the hospital. It was my own voice. It was calling my name. Story 13. The mansion stood deep in the woods, hidden beneath a canopy of twisted branches. Its grand facade was cracked and peeling, the once white columns now stained with time. The front door hung slightly ajar, as if waiting for someone to step inside. I hesitated before pushing it open, the hinges groaning in protest. A stale, musty scent filled the air, mingled with something faintly metallic. Dust swirled in the dim light filtering through the high windows. The foyer was vast, lined with tall mirrors that had long since lost their shine. A grand staircase loomed ahead, its railing wrapped in cobwebs. Faint footprints trailed across the dusty floor, leading deeper into the house. I followed the path, my footsteps muffled by thick layers of dust. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wood. Something about the place felt preserved, as if frozen in time. The hallway led me to a set of double doors, slightly ajar. Pushing them open, I stepped into a massive dining room. The furniture was covered in white sheets, draped like ghosts waiting to wake. At the center of the room stood a long, ornate dining table. The chairs were pulled out, positioned as if someone had just stood up. A fine layer of dust covered the plates and silverware, untouched yet set with eerie precision. My heart pounded as I scanned the table, my breath shallow. The glasses were still upright, some filled with murky water. Candle stubs remained in their holders, melted down to misshapen lumps. A draft whispered through the room, making the sheets ripple like unseen hands were lifting them. I turned sharply, my eyes darting to the far end of the table. A single plate sat at the head, the food on it shriveled and blackened with time. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed the plate. A sharp clang echoed through the room as a fork slipped from the table and hit the floor. My chest tightened as I stepped back, pulse hammering in my ears. A faint scuffling noise sounded from the hallway behind me. I whipped around, staring at the open doorway. Shadows seemed to shift, stretching unnaturally against the walls. I took slow steps backward, unwilling to turn my back on the darkness. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me like unseen hands. My skin prickled as the faintest whisper curled through the silence. The voice was soft, distant, almost melodic. It sent a chill racing up my spine, the words indistinct yet carrying a strange familiarity. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, every nerve in my body screaming to leave. The sound of wood scraping against the floor made me freeze. I turned back toward the table, eyes widening. One of the chairs had moved slightly, shifting ever so subtly away from the table. I stumbled backward, my breath hitching in my throat. The whispering grew louder, layered voices overlapping in hushed tones. My pulse pounded as a flicker of movement caught my eye near the far end of the room. The chandelier above rattled, the old chains groaning under some unseen weight. Dust drifted down in slow spirals, making the air thick and suffocating. My muscles locked in place as another chair shifted, scraping against the floor. I spun on my heel and bolted toward the doorway, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The moment I stepped into the hall, the whispers stopped abruptly. A thick, suffocating silence settled over the house like a weighted blanket. I didn't slow down, moving quickly toward the front door. The mirrors lining the hall reflected distorted shapes, the glass warped with age. My own reflection seemed delayed, lagging behind my movements. Reaching the entrance, I grabbed the doorknob and twisted hard. It wouldn't budge, as if something on the other side was holding it closed. Panic surged through me as I rattled the door, my breath coming in sharp gasps. A soft creak sounded from the staircase behind me. I turned my head slowly, my body trembling. A dark figure stood at the top of the stairs, motionless, watching. The shape was human-like but wrong, its limbs too elongated, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its presence sent a cold wave of terror crashing over me, pinning me in place. I yanked at the door again, my fingers slick with sweat. The figure began to move, slow and deliberate, descending the stairs one step at a time. My vision blurred with fear as I threw my weight against the door. A gust of cold air rushed through the house, slamming the doors of the dining room shut with a deafening bang. The chandelier rattled violently, the bulbs flickering before going out entirely. Darkness swallowed the space around me, my breath coming in ragged bursts. The footsteps on the stairs grew louder, each step measured and deliberate. My mind screamed for me to move, but my body refused to obey. The whispering returned, now close, weaving through my thoughts like tendrils of smoke. My knees buckled, my hands still gripping the unyielding door handle. The figure reached the bottom step and paused. A pressure built in my chest, an overwhelming sense of being watched from every angle. My vision swam as I felt something brush against my arm, light, fleeting, yet undeniably real. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deep silence that felt more suffocating than sound. A soft click echoed through the air, and suddenly the front door swung open. I didn't hesitate. I stumbled forward, nearly falling onto the stone porch. The moment I crossed the threshold, the heavy door slammed shut behind me. A burst of wind howled through the trees, drowning out the last lingering echoes of whispers. I didn't stop running until I was well past the tree line, the mansion shrinking behind me. My heart pounded as I forced myself to glance back. The house stood still, the windows dark, yet something about it felt aware. The trees around me swayed as the wind carried a single sound through the night. A whisper, soft yet unmistakable, calling my name from the depths of the mansion. Story 14. The abandoned theater had been closed for decades, its grand entrance now hidden beneath layers of dust and ivy. I had always been drawn to forgotten places, and the sight of the crumbling marquee filled me with anticipation. Pushing open the heavy doors, I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing through the vast, empty lobby. The scent of damp wood and decaying fabric lingered in the air, a reminder of the theater's long-forgotten past. The main hall was eerily silent, rows of tattered seats facing the darkened stage like an audience frozen in time. A single beam of moonlight filtered through a hole in the ceiling, casting long shadows across the floor. I walked carefully, avoiding loose boards and broken glass, my eyes drawn to the heavy curtains that still hung on the stage. Something about them felt unnatural, as if they had been disturbed recently. Curiosity led me backstage, where dust-covered props and forgotten scenery pieces cluttered the wings. The dressing rooms were lined with cracked mirrors, their surfaces clouded and warped. As I explored further, I found a door slightly ajar, its rusted hinges groaning as I pushed it open. Inside was a storage room filled with old trunks, their leather exteriors cracked with age. One particular box caught my eye, its lid slightly lifted as if inviting me to look inside. I hesitated for a moment before pulling it open, revealing an assortment of elaborate costumes draped in faded velvet and silk. The rich fabrics were surprisingly well preserved, their vibrant colors dulled only by time. My fingers brushed over a delicate lace gown, then a heavy, ornate cloak. Beneath them, something different lay hidden. At the bottom of the box was a costume unlike any I had ever seen, its details impossibly intricate. It resembled an old-fashioned suit, its buttons glinting in the dim light. The material was soft but firm, as if it had been recently worn. When I reached out and touched it, a shiver ran through me. It was warm, as if someone had just taken it off moments before. I jerked my hand away, my heart pounding. The warmth of the fabric shouldn't have been possible, not in a place abandoned for so long. I leaned in, studying it closer, noting how lifelike the folds and seams appeared. It was too realistic, too perfect, as if it weren't merely a costume at all. A strange unease settled over me, making my skin prickle. The silence of the theater felt heavier now, pressing against my ears like a held breath. I glanced over my shoulder, suddenly aware of how alone I was, or perhaps how alone I wasn't. The suit seemed to beckon me, its presence demanding attention. Against my better judgment, I reached for it again, lifting it carefully from the box. The weight of it was unsettling, the fabric clinging to my hands in a way that made my stomach churn. As I held it up, the shape became clearer, its contours eerily human. It was then that I noticed the lining, a thin layer beneath the outer material that looked almost like skin. My breath caught in my throat, my grip tightening involuntarily. A sound echoed through the room, so faint I almost thought I imagined it a slow, deliberate creak from somewhere deeper backstage. I dropped the costume back into the box, my pulse hammering in my ears. The air had shifted, charged with something unseen but undeniably present. I turned toward the doorway, suddenly desperate to leave. As I stepped away, the old wooden floor groaned beneath me, each footstep magnified in the quiet. I forced myself to move faster, my hands trembling as I reached the hallway. The mirrors lining the walls caught my reflection in fragments, distorted and flickering as I passed. I refused to look directly at them, unwilling to see anything that shouldn't be there. Reaching the stage, I stopped, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The curtains rustled slightly, though there was no breeze. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the old fabric settling, but the feeling in my gut said otherwise. The sense of being watched had intensified, prickling at the back of my neck. I took one last look at the storage room, its darkness stretching beyond the doorway. The costume lay where I had dropped it, but something was different. The folds in the fabric had shifted, the shape more rigid now, as if someone or something was still inside. I swallowed hard, backing away slowly. The moment I turned, a whisper of movement stirred behind me. I ran, no longer caring about the debris in my path, my only thought to escape. The theater seemed to stretch, the exit farther than I remembered. The walls groaned around me, as if the very building was alive, aware of my intrusion. I burst through the lobby, my breath ragged as I shoved open the heavy front doors. The cold night air hit me like a shock, but I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street. Only then did I turn back, expecting to see something or someone standing in the doorway. But the theater remained still, its entrance dark and empty. My chest heaved as I tried to collect myself, my mind racing with what I had seen. The warmth of the fabric, the unsettling human-like form, the unshakable feeling of being watched, it all lingered in my thoughts, refusing to fade. I knew I had stumbled upon something I wasn't meant to find, something that hadn't wanted to be disturbed. For days I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, that my mind had played tricks on me in the dim light of the abandoned theater. But then, One evening, I noticed something strange. Folded neatly on the chair in my bedroom was the very same suit, its buttons gleaming under the soft glow of my lamp. The warmth of it reached me even from where I stood, and I knew without a doubt that I was no longer alone. Story 15. Wandering through the abandoned amusement park, I stepped over cracked pavement and rusted rails. The scent of damp wood and decay clung to the air as the skeletal remains of roller coasters loomed overhead. Faded carnival posters flapped weakly in the breeze, their colors drained by years of neglect. A distant creaking noise echoed, though I couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else. I turned a corner and found myself in front of a rundown arcade, its once bright sign barely legible beneath layers of grime. The glass doors were shattered, and a thick layer of dust coated everything inside. Most of the machines stood lifeless, their screens dark and cracked. But in the center of the room, one flickered with an eerie blue glow. Curious, I stepped closer, my footsteps muffled by the dust-covered carpet. The machine was old, older than anything else in the arcade, its wooden casing chipped and warped. The screen pulsed weakly, illuminating a title screen that had no name, just a blinking prompt: press start. I hesitated, then pressed the single, unmarked button below. The screen flickered violently, the image warping as static hissed through unseen speakers. A grainy image appeared, like a live video feed, showing the entrance of the arcade. My breath caught in my throat when I realized I was staring at myself on the screen, standing exactly where I was now. But before I could react, my reflection on the screen stepped forward while I remained perfectly still. My stomach tightened as I watched the figure move independently, scanning the empty arcade. It turned its head in a slow, unnatural motion, peering past the machine as if it could see something I couldn't. Then, with a sharp snap, its head jerked back to face me. My own expression, my own eyes stared at me through the screen, but something about it was wrong. A distorted voice crackled from the speakers, though the lips of my reflection never moved. "You're late," it whispered, the words barely audible through the static. I took an instinctive step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The screen glitched again, distorting into a cascade of swirling colors before resetting to the original arcade entrance feed. But now my reflection was gone. A cold dread crept up my spine as I turned to glance behind me. The arcade was still empty, the silence stretching unnaturally thick. I reached out and pressed the button again, desperate for some kind of explanation. This time the screen showed a hallway long, dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and warped wooden floors. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar, a deep shadow pooling beyond its threshold. The camera view tilted, as if someone unseen was walking forward, approaching the door with slow, deliberate steps. My breath caught as my hand reached out on the screen, fingers curling around the edge of the door. But I hadn't moved an inch. The screen cut to black just as the door creaked open. A moment later, white text appeared: "Look behind you." A sharp chill gripped my spine, every nerve screaming for me not to obey. But something primal, something instinctual, forced me to turn. The arcade remained empty, but the air felt denser, as if the walls had closed in slightly. The machine whined softly, the static stretching into an unbearable hum. Then, from somewhere deep within the arcade, a faint shuffle broke the silence. I whipped around, my eyes darting across the rows of dead machines. The sound came again, closer this time, something moving in the shadows just beyond my sight. My chest tightened as I backed away, my mind racing for an exit. Then, without warning, the machine blared a high-pitched tone, and the screen came to life once more. It was another live feed, but this time it wasn't of the arcade. It was showing a reflection again, but not mine. A figure stood in front of the machine, its shape distorted, its face a dark void. It tilted its head slightly, mimicking the movement I had made earlier. My breath hitched as it raised one hand and slowly placed it against the screen. The moment its fingers touched the glass, a deep vibration ran through the arcade, rattling the machines and sending dust cascading from the ceiling. The lights flickered, and a gust of cold air rushed past me, carrying the faint scent of something rotten. My skin prickled as the machine screen flashed erratic symbols, each one pulsing before fading into unreadable gibberish. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something unseen, and crashed against a row of lifeless cabinets. The machine let out one final burst of static before the screen cut to black. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering, and bolted toward the exit, not daring to look back. The night air hit me like a wave as I burst outside, my lungs gulping the crisp, damp breeze. The amusement park stretched before me, eerily still, as if it had been holding its breath. I forced myself to keep moving, my footsteps echoing against the cracked pavement. But as I reached the park's rusted gates, a chill crept up my spine once more. I turned to glance back at the arcade, half expecting to see something lurking in the doorway. Instead, the machine inside flickered to life again, its glow barely visible through the shattered windows. My pulse pounded as the screen revealed another live feed. It wasn't of the arcade. It wasn't of the hallway. It was showing me standing outside the park gates, but I wasn't alone. A figure loomed just behind me, its face obscured in darkness, its form barely distinguishable from the night. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There was nothing there. But when I looked back at the screen, the figure had moved closer. The last thing I saw before I turned and ran was the reflection's hand reaching toward my shoulder. Story 16. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, its crumbling exterior barely holding together under the weight of time. Ivy snaked up the walls and shattered windows yawned like dark mouths. I had heard the stories, the whispers of strange occurrences, but curiosity pushed me past my better judgment. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the scent of mildew clung to every surface. My flashlight flickered as I stepped cautiously over debris, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The peeling wallpaper curled away from the walls, revealing the skeletal remains of the building's past. I moved through the halls, my breath shallow as the atmosphere pressed against me. Wheelchairs sat abandoned, their wheels frozen in time, and rusted bed frames lined the corridors like sentinels. Faded patient records were scattered across the floor, the ink smeared by time and moisture. Eventually, I reached a large room filled with rows of old, dusty beds. Some still had tattered sheets draped over them, undisturbed for years. But one bed stood out from the rest, its sheet bore the distinct impression of a handprint, as if someone had just been lying there. My stomach twisted, and I took a hesitant step closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. The dust around the bed was unsettled, as though something had moved recently. I reached out, my fingers hovering just above the sheet, feeling the icy air that clung to it. A sudden creak behind me made my heart jolt, and I spun around, my flashlight beam darting across the empty room. The beds stood silent, their metal frames casting long shadows against the decayed walls. Yet the feeling of being watched crawled up my spine, prickling at my senses. I swallowed hard and turned back to the bed, determined to understand what I was seeing. The handprint was crisp, fresh, unlike anything else in the room. Slowly, I pressed my own hand over it, and an unnatural chill seeped into my skin. A whisper drifted through the stillness, so faint I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. My throat tightened as I glanced around, my grip on the flashlight unsteady. The beds remained motionless, yet something about the room felt different, like I was no longer alone. The air grew dense, pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. A shadow flickered in the corner of my vision, gone the moment I turned my head. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my legs refused to move, frozen by an unseen force. Then the beds began to creak, one after another, as if something unseen was shifting upon them. The metal groaned beneath invisible weight, and the sheet on the bed before me ruffled as though someone had just risen. A suffocating dread curled in my stomach, cold sweat beating at my temples. A sound like distant laughter echoed from the hallway, warped and distorted as if carried through water. I forced myself to back away, my movements stiff, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The floorboards beneath me felt unstable, as if the entire building was breathing around me. As I reached the doorway, the flashlight flickered violently before plunging me into darkness. Panic seized my chest as I fumbled with the switch, my fingers trembling. The air crackled with a strange energy, a static hum pressing against my ears. Then, something brushed past me, the sensation unmistakable, a whisper of movement in the pitch-black void. I choked back a cry, my instincts screaming at me to run. The flashlight sputtered back to life, illuminating the empty beds, their sheets now rumpled as though multiple figures had risen from them. A deep, guttural breath sounded inches from my ear, sending icy tendrils of fear through my body. I lurched forward, breaking into a blind sprint down the hallway. My footsteps echoed wildly, chased by an eerie rustling that followed too close behind. The corridor stretched endlessly, warping into a maze of peeling walls and rotting doors. My lungs burned as I ran, my mind screaming that I had made a terrible mistake coming here. The asylum felt alive, shifting around me, refusing to let me leave. I skidded into a stairwell, nearly toppling over the rusted railing. The steps groaned under my weight as I took them two at a time, the heavy air pressing against my back like unseen hands. Shadows darted along the edges of my vision, moving with unnatural speed. Reaching the main hall, I threw myself at the exit, my fingers scrabbling at the rusted handle. It wouldn't budge. The wood swollen with age, trapping me inside. A strangled sob clawed up my throat as I slammed my shoulder against the door, desperation taking hold. Behind me, the sound of dragging footsteps filled the space, slow and deliberate. My entire body stiffened as I turned my head, dread coiling deep in my gut. The doorway to the room of bed stood open, but the figures standing among them had not been there before. Shrouded in darkness, their forms barely distinguishable, they loomed between the beds, motionless. Their faces were obscured, but I could feel their gaze piercing through the veil of shadows. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, and the floor beneath me trembled. A single step forward from one of the figures sent a jolt of terror through me. My hands clawed at the door, nails scraping against wood as I tried to pry it open. The dragging footsteps drew closer, the presence behind me growing heavier, suffocating. With a final, desperate shove, the door burst open, and I stumbled into the night. The cold air hit me like a wave, shocking me back into reality. I turned once, expecting to see something following, but the doorway was empty, the asylum silent once more. Gasping for breath, I staggered back to my car, my mind racing to make sense of what had happened. The asylum loomed in the distance, its broken windows reflecting the moonlight like vacant eyes. Whatever lingered inside, it had been watching me the entire time. I fumbled for my keys, my hands still trembling as I shoved them into the ignition. The engine sputtered before roaring to life, and I wasted no time peeling away from that cursed place. But even as I left it behind, the feeling of unseen eyes never faded. Story 17. The air inside the church was thick with dust, the scent of decay clinging to the remnants of rotting wood and damp stone. Faint light filtered through shattered stained glass windows, casting broken colors across the abandoned pews. The silence was oppressive, pressing in from all sides as I stepped cautiously down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. At the far end of the church, an old organ loomed against the wall, its pipes stretching toward the vaulted ceiling like skeletal fingers. The keys were coated in grime and some had crumbled away, revealing the rotted wood beneath. Something about it called to me, an odd compulsion drawing me forward until my fingers hovered over the keys. I pressed one cautiously, expecting nothing but silence or a dull thud from the broken instrument. Instead, a low, resonant note filled the air, rich and haunting, as though the organ still breathed despite its age. My hand jerked away, heart hammering in my chest as the note continued, joined by another and then another, forming a slow, mournful melody. The sound swelled, filling the cavernous space with a song that felt both familiar and foreign, its tune winding like a whisper through the ruins. My breath came shallow as I stepped back, but the music did not stop. The keys moved of their own accord, pressing down in perfect rhythm. Each note reverberated against the cracked stone walls, making the church feel impossibly alive. A shiver ran through me as I turned in a slow circle, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Dust swirled in the dim light, shifting as though disturbed by an unseen presence. The pews remained empty, the altar untouched, yet the music persisted, as though played by invisible hands. Something about the tune unsettled me. It was neither joyous nor sorrowful, but something in between, teetering on the edge of remembrance and regret. My pulse quickened as I took another step back, my mind racing to rationalize what I was hearing. The organ's pipes groaned, expelling a long, wheezing breath that made the melody seem almost human. A gust of wind rushed through the broken doors behind me, stirring the dust into twisting shapes that dissipated almost as quickly as they formed. My eyes darted toward the entrance, where the wind howled like a distant voice calling from beyond the grave. The organ continued its eerie song, the notes dipping into an unfamiliar, discordant rhythm. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I forced myself to approach the instrument again. There had to be an explanation, perhaps a mechanism hidden within, a trick of old machinery refusing to die. Yet as I reached for the keys once more, the music stopped abruptly, cutting off mid-note with an eerie finality. Silence pressed down once more, heavier than before, as if the air itself had thickened. My fingers brushed the keys, and a sudden chill shot up my arm, so cold it burned. I yanked my hand away, my breath coming in quick, uneven bursts. The sensation lingered, the icy touch fading only as I backed away from the organ. A sound broke the stillness, not from the instrument, but from somewhere deeper within the church. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew, taking shape into something unmistakable. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing from the darkened hallway near the altar. I turned sharply, my body tense, eyes locked on the shadows shifting in the far corner. The footsteps continued, each one measured, unhurried, as though whoever or whatever was approaching had all the time in the world. My skin prickled as the air grew colder, breath turning to mist before me. I took a step back, then another, resisting the urge to run despite every instinct screaming at me. The footsteps halted just before the light, a figure barely visible in the darkness. A shape stood at the threshold of the hallway, unmoving, silent, watching. My breath caught in my throat as the organ let out a single, shuddering note. The figure stirred, shifting slightly, but its features remained obscured by shadow. The note hung in the air, vibrating as though the church itself trembled in anticipation. Then, in a voice so low it barely reached me, the figure whispered something I couldn't understand. Cold terror settled into my bones as I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The organ groaned once more, the pipes exhaling a final, rattling breath. The figure did not move further, yet I felt its presence pressing against me, unseen fingers curling at the edge of my mind. I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the cracked stone floor, each breath sharp and ragged. The open doorway loomed ahead, moonlight spilling across the threshold like a lifeline. Behind me, the organ let out one last, mournful chord, stretching long and hollow into the night. I burst into the cold night air, stumbling onto the overgrown path that led away from the ruins. The wind howled through the trees, drowning out everything but the pounding of my own heart. I didn't stop running until the church was nothing more than a shadow in the distance, swallowed by the night. Even then, the melody lingered in my mind, looping endlessly, as if the church had branded it into my very soul. The sensation of icy fingers on my skin had yet to fade, a phantom touch that would not let me forget. Somewhere in the darkness, I swore I could still hear the organ playing. Story 18. The hotel stood at the edge of town, its windows dark, its neon sign long burned out. Curiosity got the better of me as I pushed open the heavy front doors, which groaned against their rusted hinges. The lobby was thick with dust, the air stale, as if it had been sealed off from the world for years. Faded furniture sat undisturbed, the reception desk standing eerily intact. A single lamp flickered behind the counter, casting long shadows across the room. I stepped closer and saw the guest book lying open, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. My fingers hesitated before flipping through the entries, most of them dated decades ago, but the most recent one made my breath hitch. It was written in fresh, black ink, the words stark against the page, "I'm waiting in room 402. My pulse quickened as I traced the ink, feeling the slightest smudge beneath my fingertips. Someone had written this recently, maybe minutes ago. I glanced around the empty lobby, the silence suddenly heavier. Room 402. The number clawed at my mind, urging me to investigate, but dread settled deep in my gut. I swallowed hard and turned toward the grand staircase at the far end of the lobby. Each step groaned beneath my weight as I ascended, dust rising in the air, disturbed for the first time in years. The second floor was lined with peeling wallpaper, the pattern barely visible under the grime. Faint drafts slipped through broken windows, making the chandeliers above sway slightly. The third floor felt even colder, the air thick with an unplaceable scent, something metallic beneath the dust. When I reached the fourth, an unsettling hush settled over everything. The hallway stretched before me, lined with doors, their numbers hanging askew or missing entirely. But one stood out, room 402, its brass number still polished, its door slightly ajar. A breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer, my fingers curling into fists at my sides. The darkness inside seemed to spill out, thick and unmoving. I pressed my palm against the door and pushed it open with a slow creak. The room was dim, the only light coming from a window covered in torn curtains. A single chair sat in the center, facing the door, empty but eerily expectant. The air was colder here, biting through my clothes as I stepped inside. The scent of damp wood and something bitter filled my nose, making me swallow against nausea. My eyes landed on the bed, its sheets perfectly made, untouched. But on the pillow, a single page lay flat, ink still drying on the words, "I knew you'd come." My pulse thundered in my ears. A sharp creak behind me made me spin, heart hammering as I scanned the shadows. The door had drifted closed, the hallway now a distant memory. My breathing turned shallow as I stepped backward, my foot catching on something. I looked down, my stomach twisting. Another page, this one scrawled in hurried strokes, "Don't turn around." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen. The silence pressed against my ears, thick and suffocating. I forced myself to move, to reach for the door handle, but the moment my fingers grazed it, a whisper brushed the back of my neck. It wasn't a sound, it was a presence, something just behind me. A cold fear flooded my veins as I squeezed my eyes shut. The paper had warned me. My breath trembled as I gripped the handle tighter, twisting it with a slow, deliberate motion. The door wouldn't budge. Something was keeping me here, holding the air still around me. A pulse of cold air ran down my spine, a whisper of movement at my back. My stomach lurched as I felt it, something just inches away, waiting. My shaking fingers fumbled with the lock, finally wrenching it free. The door burst open, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. The corridor stretched endlessly now, the dim lights flickering overhead. My footsteps echoed as I moved, the air feeling thicker, heavier. The door to room 402 remained open behind me, an invitation I had no intention of accepting. My only thought was to get out, to leave this place before whatever was inside followed. I reached the stairs, my heart pounding against my ribs. The descent felt longer than before, each step stretching time, pulling me deeper into something unseen. When I finally reached the lobby, the guest book still lay open, the ink from the last entry smeared slightly. My hand hovered over the pages, hesitant to touch it again. A sound broke the silence, a slow, deliberate knock. My blood ran cold as I turned my head toward the source. It came from the front desk where an old service bell sat untouched. But now it rang, its sharp chime cutting through the thick air. My breath hitched as the realization sank in. Someone or something had rung it. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The bell rang again, louder this time, the sharp clang vibrating through my bones. I forced my feet to move, stumbling toward the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. The moment I pushed it open, the air shifted behind me, as if something had stepped closer. The cold breath of an unseen presence sent every hair on my body standing on end. I didn't dare look back. I stepped into the night, the door swinging shut behind me with a heavy thud. The hotel loomed in silence, its windows empty, watching. My car was still where I left it, the sight of it grounding me in reality. My fingers trembled as I dug for my keys, sliding into the driver's seat with frantic urgency. As the engine roared to life, I dared one last glance at the building. The fourth-floor window was no longer empty. A figure stood behind the glass, unmoving, watching me. My breath hitched as I gripped the wheel tighter. It wasn't a trick of the light. Someone or something was still inside, waiting. I slammed the car into reverse, tearing away from the curb. The town blurred past as I drove, my hands gripping the wheel with white-knuckled force. My pulse refused to slow, my mind replaying every moment inside that cursed hotel. The guest book, the whispers, the warnings, they weren't just remnants of the past. Something had been there with me, something that still lingered. I didn't stop driving until the hotel was miles behind me, the road stretching endlessly ahead. But even as the town faded into the distance, an unsettling truth settled deep within me. The last entry in the guest book had been fresh, ink still wet, waiting for someone to read it. Waiting for someone like me. Story 19. I wandered into the abandoned factory, the scent of rust and dampness thick in the air. The walls were coated in grime, streaked with the remains of old machinery oil. Large steel beams loomed overhead, their supports covered in dust and cobwebs. The silence was almost suffocating as I stepped carefully over broken glass and twisted metal. Faded caution signs still clung to the walls, their warnings barely legible. The further I went, the heavier the air seemed to become, as if the building itself was holding its breath. At the far end of the factory floor, I found a small room with a rusted metal door hanging slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I was met with a surprisingly intact control room. Rows of monitors lined the walls, their blank screens reflecting the dim light filtering in from the grimy windows. My fingers brushed over the dust-coated consoles, feeling the grooves of switches and dials long forgotten. A thick binder sat on the desk, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The air smelled of mildew and burnt wiring, as if the room had been sealed off for decades. I reached for one of the switches, hesitating before pressing it down. A low hum rumbled through the walls, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Then, a series of overhead lights flickered to life, casting eerie, flickering beams across the room. The machines outside groaned as they sputtered back to life, gears grinding against years of neglect. Conveyor belts jerked forward in fits and starts, rattling as they struggled to move. The sound of rushing air filled the space as vents expelled dust and debris in thick clouds. I took a step back, my pulse pounding as the monitors crackled with static. Faint images flickered on the screens, distorted shapes moving in the darkness of the factory floor. The grainy footage seemed to live, but that was impossible. There was no one else here. One of the monitors displayed a corridor I hadn't seen before, the camera angle shifting slightly as if tracking movement. The image sharpened, revealing a figure standing motionless in the shadows. My breath hitched as I recognized the layout of the hallway was just outside the control room. I turned quickly, my gaze darting to the open doorway. The hallway was empty, but the sound of metal creaking echoed through the walls. The machines were running, but there were no workers. There hadn't been for years. The static on the monitors cleared again, and I saw another figure step into view. It was standing in the same hallway, just outside the door. The screen flickered, and when it steadied, the figure was closer. Too close. I spun around and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I locked it. The hum of the factory grew louder, the machines no longer struggling but running smoothly, as if they had never stopped. The lights overhead buzzed, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally. A low vibration ran through the floor, rattling the control panels. The monitors now displayed different angles of the factory, showing machines operating with precision. Robotic arms lifted unseen materials, conveyor belts moved steadily, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the halls. My breathing was shallow as I backed away from the screens, but a sudden movement on one made me freeze. A reflection in the glass showed something standing behind me. I turned sharply, but the room was empty. Yet I could feel a presence, something unseen but watching. The door handle rattled violently, the metal groaning under pressure. I stepped back, my heart pounding as I pressed myself against the console. The humming of the machines grew deafening, the entire factory vibrating with renewed energy. The monitors displayed a final image before cutting to static rows of workers, standing at their stations, motionless. Their faces were blank, expressionless, their eyes hollow. The machines around them moved with eerie precision, but they did not. They simply stood, waiting. The lights flickered again, and suddenly the room was silent. The hum died instantly, leaving only the sound of my own rapid breathing. The monitors went dark, the factory floor beyond the control room still and lifeless once more. I stood there, listening, waiting for something else to happen. The air felt different, heavier, as if the building had exhaled its last breath. Slowly, I reached for the door handle, bracing myself for what might be outside. The hallway was empty, just as it had been before. The factory floor was still coated in dust and rust, the machines frozen in time once more. It was as if none of it had ever happened. Yet, as I stepped out of the control room, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A single footprint in the dust, leading away into the darkness. Story 20. The old zoo had been abandoned for years, its entrance gate hanging open, rusted chains still dangling from the latch. Weeds had overtaken the pathways, winding through the cracked pavement like nature reclaiming what man had left behind. The buildings loomed in eerie silence, their faded signs barely legible beneath years of dust and decay. I wandered deeper, past crumbling enclosures and shattered glass, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and mold. The remains of cages lined the path, their bars bent and broken, as if something had forced its way out. Somewhere in the distance, the wind moaned through the trees, carrying whispers of forgotten things. The lion's cage stood at the end of the path, larger than the others, its once formidable bars now coated in rust. The metal gate creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing into the stillness. I hesitated before stepping inside, my breath shallow, the air heavy with an almost tangible weight. Inside, the ground was littered with old bones, brittle and discolored, their edges worn smooth with time. The walls were covered in deep scratches, claw marks that ran from floor to ceiling. A strange sensation crawled up my spine, something primal, an instinct warning me that I was not alone. Then I heard it, a deep, slow breath, resonating through the darkness like a steady pulse. It came from the back of the enclosure, where the shadows stretched thick and unmoving. I swallowed hard, my heartbeat thudding against my ribs, the sound of that breath too deliberate, too measured to belong to any animal. I took a cautious step forward, my shoes crunching over old debris, the air growing colder the closer I got. The breathing remained steady, unfaltering, as if whatever lurked in the shadows knew I was there. The rusted bars at the back of the enclosure had been forced apart, twisted open like fingers pried too far. Something moved beyond them, just beyond my sight, shifting in the darkness. A whisper of movement, a subtle shift in the stale air, but enough to make my skin prickle. I knew I should turn back, leave while I still could, but my feet remained rooted in place. A low rumble echoed through the cage, not quite a growl, not quite a sigh, but something in between. The sound carried with it an eerie patience, like whatever was there had been waiting for a long time. My breath hitched as the shadows seemed to ripple, something tall and hunched stirring within them. I took a step back, heart pounding, the air growing thick and oppressive around me. The bars behind me suddenly felt too far away, the exit impossibly distant. The thing in the darkness exhaled again, slow and steady, as if testing the space between us. A metallic clang rang out as something heavy scraped against the bars, the rusted metal groaning under unseen weight. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I turned sharply, stumbling toward the exit. The air behind me shifted, movement too large to be ignored, but I didn't dare look back. I reached the open gate just as a shadow stretched across the ground beside me, long and unnatural. My hands fumbled against the metal, cold and damp beneath my grip, the scent of decay clinging to my skin. Something let out another slow breath, closer now, just behind me. I bolted, nearly tripping over the uneven ground as I sprinted away from the cage. The air around me felt heavy, like something unseen was still reaching for me, its presence stretching beyond the bars. My footsteps pounded against the cracked pavement, but even as I ran, I swore I could still hear it breathing. The zoo blurred past me, cages and ruins melting into a whirlwind of rust and shadows. I didn't stop until I reached the entrance, my lungs burning, my hands trembling as I gripped the old gate. The air here felt lighter, but the weight of what I had seen or hadn't seen clung to me. I risked one last glance over my shoulder, my chest still heaving from exertion. The lion's cage stood silent, its bars as rusted and broken as before, but the shadows within had shifted. Something watched me from the darkness, unseen but undeniable, waiting. I turned and left without looking back again, the echoes of slow, measured breaths following me into the fading light. The zoo remained behind, swallowed by time and silence, but I knew I had not been alone in that cage. Whatever was there had seen me, known me, and it was still waiting. Story 21. The school stood in eerie silence, its windows shattered and its doors hanging open like a long-forgotten relic. Nature had started reclaiming the building, with vines creeping through cracks in the brick and weeds bursting through the pavement. The air smelled of dust and decay, the remnants of a place once filled with voices now swallowed by time. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. Lockers lined the walls, their paint chipped and rusted, some hanging open as if waiting for their owners to return. Faded posters still clung stubbornly to the bulletin boards, their edges curling with age. The deeper I walked, the more I felt the weight of the stillness pressing in. My fingers brushed over the cool metal of a locker door, the surface rough with rust. Without thinking, I pulled it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the space was mostly empty, except for a single photograph resting on the metal shelf. My stomach twisted as I reached for it, a cold prickle running down my spine. The picture showed me standing at the entrance of the school, just moments before I had walked in. My posture, my clothes, the way my hand gripped the door, it was exactly how I had been only minutes ago. The air around me felt heavier, like the walls themselves had come alive to watch me. I turned the photo over, but there was nothing on the back, no date or message. My breathing felt shallow as I glanced around, my eyes scanning the hallway for any sign of movement. The thought crept into my mind like a slow chill, someone had been watching me. My pulse quickened as I stepped back, the locker door still swinging slightly on its rusty hinges. The silence around me was no longer just quiet, it was expectant, charged with something unseen. The air smelled different now, carrying a hint of something metallic, something wrong. I turned sharply, scanning the dim hallway, my heart beat loud in my ears. The lockers stretched into the darkness, their doors gaping like open mouths. A flickering light down the corridor buzzed softly, casting unsteady shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. The picture in my hand felt heavier now, the glossy surface slick against my fingers. I shoved it into my pocket, suddenly desperate to leave, to put distance between myself and whatever had taken it. My feet moved quickly, but the further I went, the more the hallway seemed to stretch. I passed by a classroom with its door ajar, the desks inside frozen in time beneath a thick layer of dust. The chalkboard still bore faded remnants of a long-forgotten lesson, numbers and words scrawled in a ghostly hand. The stillness felt suffocating, as if the air itself had thickened. Something clicked behind me, a soft but deliberate sound. My body tensed as I turned slowly, my eyes landing on the locker I had just opened. It was shut now, latched as if I had never touched it. A deep, gnawing unease settled in my gut. I forced myself to take a step back, every instinct screaming at me to leave. The floor beneath me creaked loudly, the sound splitting the silence like a warning. My eyes darted to the broken windows, calculating how fast I could get out. Then, the lights above me flickered once, twice, before cutting out completely. The hallway was plunged into near darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint slivers of dying daylight seeping through the cracks. The air turned frigid, sending a violent shiver through me. A sound echoed from further down the hall, a slow, deliberate footstep. It was followed by another, then another, moving steadily closer. My throat went dry as I backed away, my fingers trembling at my sides. The footsteps stopped, the silence pressing in with unbearable weight. My pulse pounded in my ears as I strained to listen, to make sense of what was happening. Then, just as suddenly as they had stopped, they started again, closer this time. My breath hitched as I turned and bolted, my feet slamming against the dust-covered floor. The hallway blurred past me, lockers flashing by in a distorted tunnel of rusted metal and peeling paint. My only thought was escape. The exit burned into my mind. The front doors loomed ahead, their wooden frames warped with time, but still standing. I pushed against them, expecting resistance, but they flew open easily. I stumbled outside, gasping for air, the cold evening air biting at my skin. The silence outside was different, no longer pressing but vast and empty. I turned to look at the school, half expecting to see someone watching from the broken windows. But there was nothing, only the hollow shell of the building standing in the dying light. I reached into my pocket, my fingers closing around the photograph. Slowly, I pulled it out, dreading what I might see. The picture had changed. Now, instead of me standing at the entrance, the photo showed me inside the school, looking over my shoulder. Behind me, barely visible in the dim light, was a shadowed figure standing at the end of the hallway. A sharp, ice-cold fear gripped my chest as I stared at the image, my hands shaking. That figure hadn't been there when I took the photo from the locker. I would have seen them. I would have felt them. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, but I barely noticed. My eyes remained fixed on the photo, my mind racing with the impossibility of it. I had been alone. I was sure of it. I dropped the picture, watching as it fluttered to the ground, landing face up on the cracked pavement. My body screamed at me to leave, to run, to never look back. But something inside me hesitated, an irrational urge to understand what had just happened. The last bit of sunlight dipped below the horizon, the shadows stretching across the school's facade. The building stood silent once more, indifferent to the fear clawing at my chest. I took one last glance at the photo before stepping back, my breathing still uneven. Then, without another thought, I turned and walked away, my pace quick but steady. Even as I left the school behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had followed me, that somewhere, hidden in the growing darkness, eyes were still watching. Story 22. The mansion loomed at the edge of the forest, its silhouette broken and sagging with age. The front doors were slightly ajar, creaking as the wind pushed against them. Vines curled around the pillars, gripping the wood like fingers unwilling to let go. Stepping inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of rotting wood. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, revealing splintered boards beneath. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft sound of my footsteps on the warped floor. A grand staircase stood in the center of the foyer, its railing coated in dust. Chandeliers hung overhead, their crystals dulled with time. Doorways stretched into darkened rooms, their contents long forgotten and untouched. I moved deeper into the house, my fingers brushing against the crumbling walls. The air grew colder as I passed through an arched doorway leading into a long corridor. The hallway was lined with tall mirrors, their gilded frames tarnished with age. The glass was warped, some mirrors cracked, others covered in a thin layer of grime. My own reflection stared back, distorted by the imperfections in the glass. The further I walked, the more the air seemed to shift, pressing against me like unseen hands. Halfway down the corridor, I stopped. One of the mirrors showed something that shouldn't have been there. A figure stood just behind me, its form faint, barely more than a shadow in the glass. My breath caught as I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway behind me was empty, the air still and unmoving. But when I turned back to the mirror, the figure remained, closer than before. A deep chill settled into my bones as I stared into the reflection. The figure was tall and shrouded in darkness, its face obscured. It did not move, did not shift, only loomed just behind my shoulder. I took a slow step back, watching to see if the reflection changed. The figure moved with me, staying just out of reach. The closer I looked, the more I felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing into me. The silence in the hallway became deafening, thick with something unseen. I swallowed hard, forcing my breathing to steady. Reaching out, I touched the surface of the mirror, my fingertips meeting the cold glass. A faint breath of air brushed the back of my neck. I spun around again, my pulse hammering, but there was still nothing behind me. The hall stretched on in both directions, empty except for the dust drifting through the dim light. I turned back to the mirror, my body rigid with unease. The figure had moved even closer, standing just inches from my reflection. My breath hitched as I realized something else: the figure had no reflection in the other mirrors. A sharp crack split the air, and the mirror's surface splintered beneath my fingertips. Jagged lines spread outward, distorting the reflection. The figure did not move, but I felt something stir in the air, a presence thick and oppressive. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing as the lights overhead flickered. The shadows in the mirror seemed to stretch, creeping toward me in unnatural ways. A low whisper echoed down the hall, though the words were too faint to understand. The air around me grew heavier, pressing against my chest. My legs felt sluggish, as if the floor were holding me in place. A deep sense of unease settled into my bones, my instincts screaming at me to leave. I turned and ran, my footsteps loud against the wooden floor. The mirrors blurred as I passed, reflections twisting in unnatural ways. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices murmuring from the glass. Reaching the end of the hallway, I grasped the doorknob, my hands slick with sweat. The door wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pulled. The whispering behind me rose into a soft, almost mocking laughter. Spinning around, I saw that every mirror now held the same figure. Dozens of reflections stared back, each shadowed form lingering behind my own. The air crackled with energy, and the floorboards beneath me groaned. A shattering sound rang out as the first mirror burst, shards of glass spilling across the floor. One by one, the others followed, filling the corridor with sharp, echoing cracks. The reflections fractured, the figures twisting and writhing in the broken glass. I covered my ears, the noise deafening, like a chorus of voices screaming from within the shards. The ground beneath me trembled, and the walls groaned as if the house itself were coming alive. The light overhead flickered violently, plunging me into brief moments of darkness. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The air was still once more, the hallway deathly silent. I lowered my hand slowly, my breath coming in short gasps. The mirrors were gone, replaced by empty frames lining the walls. The shattered glass had vanished, leaving no trace of what had just happened. The only evidence of what I had seen was the lingering chill in the air. I backed away, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The whispers were gone, but the weight of unseen eyes remained. I had no desire to see what else the mansion held. Moving quickly, I retraced my steps through the house, my skin crawling with the sensation of being watched. The air felt heavier, the house seeming darker than before. Every shadow stretched too far, every corner held something just beyond sight. I reached the front door and shoved it open, stepping out into the cold night air. The moment I crossed the threshold, a weight lifted from my chest, allowing me to breathe freely again. The mansion loomed behind me, its windows dark and empty. A final gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying a faint whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't look back as I walked away, my only thought to put as much distance as possible between myself and that cursed house. But as I reached the tree line, something caught my eye. In the broken window of the mansion, a faint reflection still remained. A dark figure stood just behind the glass, watching me leave. Story 23. The factory loomed ahead, its skeletal remains stretching toward the overcast sky. Rusted metal and shattered windows gave it an air of abandonment, long forgotten by the world. A cold breeze carried the scent of damp earth and decay, whispering through the broken beams. I stepped through the gaping entrance, my boots crunching against scattered debris. The vast space inside was filled with rusted machinery, conveyor belts frozen in time. Patches of darkness clung to the corners, swallowing anything beyond the reach of the dim light seeping through the cracks. The silence felt heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of settling metal. I moved carefully, my breath shallow as I scanned the space. Faded signs hung from the rafters, their letters barely legible beneath years of dust and grime. A long corridor stretched to the left, lined with dented lockers and peeling paint. The air grew stale as I walked further in, the scent of mildew thickening. A single flickering bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting erratic shadows against the walls. A rusted door stood ajar at the end of the hall, its edges corroded with time. I hesitated before pushing it open, revealing a small room lined with metal racks. Old uniforms hung limply, their fabrics stiff with age, untouched for years. The sight of them sent a chill through me, their presence too orderly for a place so abandoned. Some bore faded name tags, their lettering smudged beyond recognition. Dust coated the fabric, except for one. A single uniform stood apart, draped over a chair in the center of the room. The fabric was damp, streaked with mud as if someone had just worn it. The sight sent an uneasy prickle up my spine, my fingers twitching with hesitation. I stepped closer, my pulse thrumming in my ears. The mud was fresh, still damp to the touch, smudging against my fingertips. The air carried a strange, metallic scent, something deeper than rust. A faint trail of wet footprints led away from the chair, vanishing into the shadows beyond the doorway. My chest tightened as I traced them with my eyes, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The factory was supposed to be abandoned. A distant sound echoed from deeper within the building, a faint shuffling of movement. I froze, my muscles locking as I strained to listen. The noise was slow, deliberate, as if someone was carefully stepping through the debris. I backed away from the chair, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. The air felt heavier now, pressing in from all sides. Another noise followed, the sound of fabric brushing against metal. I turned sharply, my gaze sweeping over the racks of uniforms. They hung still, unmoving in the stale air. Yet, the feeling of being watched gnawed at the edges of my mind. The door behind me let out a soft creak, shifting slightly as if touched by unseen hands. I clenched my fists, my skin prickling with the cold sweat creeping down my back. Something was wrong. The footprints leading out of the room no longer faded into the distance. Instead, they trailed back toward me, stopping just outside the door. My breath hitched as I took a shaky step backward. A low sound, barely more than a whisper, slithered through the silence. My pulse pounded as I fought the urge to turn and run. The sound was closer now, coming from just beyond the threshold. A flicker of movement caught the corner of my vision, something shifting in the dark hallway. My hands clenched as I forced myself to move, stepping toward the door with slow, measured movements. The factory felt different now, as if something had woken from its slumber. I pressed my back against the doorframe, my breath uneven. The corridor stretched before me, lined with shadowed corners and peeling paint. The footprints, once leading away, now led directly to where I stood. A sudden crash shattered the silence, metal clattering somewhere deep within the factory. I flinched, my heart slamming against my ribs. The sound echoed endlessly, swallowed by the vast emptiness around me. I took a step forward, my instincts screaming to leave. The factory groaned in response, the walls seeming to exhale around me. Each movement felt like an invitation for something unseen to close in. Another whisper, this time closer, sent ice through my veins. It wasn't the wind, nor the settling of the building. It was deliberate, purposeful, a voice just beyond my reach. I bolted down the hallway, my footsteps loud against the cracked floor. The space around me felt tighter, the air thickening with every step. The entrance was still far away, the open doorway a distant hope. A shadow stretched across the wall ahead, shifting unnaturally against the flickering light. I skidded to a stop, my breath caught in my throat. Someone or something stood at the far end of the hall. The figure remained still, its outline barely distinguishable from the darkness. My chest ached with the effort of holding my breath. The silence stretched, unbearable, waiting for something to break it. The figure took a slow step forward, its movements fluid yet unnatural. My body screamed for me to run, but I couldn't force myself to move. The factory walls seemed to tighten, pressing inward, trapping me in place. A metallic scent flooded my senses, sharp and overwhelming. The figure took another step, and the flickering light illuminated a flash of fabric. The uniform, the same one from the small room. My stomach lurched as I stumbled backward, my legs trembling. The figure tilted its head as if studying me. The whispering returned, curling around my ears like invisible fingers. I turned and sprinted, my lungs burning as I raced toward the exit. The factory groaned in protest, the walls shuddering with unseen force. The air crackled with something unnatural, pressing against my back. The doorway loomed ahead, an opening to the outside world. I pushed forward, the weight of the factory clawing at my heels. The whispers turned to a deafening hum, vibrating through the walls. Just as I crossed the threshold, the air behind me collapsed into silence. I stumbled onto the cracked pavement outside, my chest heaving. The factory stood quiet once more, as if nothing had ever stirred within. I turned back, my hands shaking as I wiped the sweat from my brow. The doorway gaped like an open mouth, waiting. Inside, past the threshold, a single wet footprint marked the floor. It wasn't mine. Story 24. The abandoned church stood at the edge of town, its once grand steeple leaning slightly as if bowing under the weight of time. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, wrapping around the broken stained glass windows like nature's attempt to reclaim what had been left behind. The wooden doors were warped and splintered, but they creaked open with little resistance. A musty scent of damp wood and aged paper filled the air as I stepped inside. The pews were covered in dust, their surfaces marked by time and decay. The silence was heavy, pressing against my ears like a held breath. Shafts of light filtered through the shattered windows, casting fractured colors along the stone floor. The atmosphere was still, as if the church had been frozen in time. I walked cautiously down the center aisle, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust. The altar loomed ahead, its once polished surface dulled with age. Then I saw a single candle burning in the center, its small flame flickering in the dim light. The wax had barely melted, fresh and untouched, as if someone had lit it moments before my arrival. A chill ran through me, my pulse quickening. The church had been abandoned for decades, left to rot after the town dwindled away. There should have been no one here, no reason for a candle to be burning. The air smelled faintly of melted wax, a scent that shouldn't have existed in a place left to ruin. I approached the altar slowly, my eyes locked on the flame. The candle was thick, ivory-colored, and pristine despite the dust coating everything else. I reached out hesitantly, half expecting my touch to reveal some trick of the mind. The heat from the flame was real, pulsing softly against my fingertips. A sound echoed from the back of the church, a soft shuffle, barely more than a whisper against the stillness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes darted toward the source, but the shadows remained undisturbed. The sensation of being watched prickled at my skin, a slow, creeping unease settling into my bones. I turned back to the candle, my mind racing. Had someone been here before me? If so, where were they now? The idea that someone else was lurking in the abandoned church, unseen, sent a ripple of dread through me. I swallowed hard and forced myself to remain calm. The candle's flame flickered violently for a moment, though there was no breeze. My stomach twisted as I stepped back, my instincts screaming at me to leave. Something about this place felt wrong, like I had stepped into a space that was no longer meant for the living. The air seemed heavier now, thick with an unspoken presence. A quiet creak sounded behind me, like the gentle pressure of a footstep against old wood. I spun around, my pulse hammering, but there was nothing but empty pews and crumbling walls. My breath came in shallow gasps as I strained to listen, my heart pounding against my ribs. The candle's glow cast long, shifting shadows that danced along the stone. I took another step backward, my mind racing with possibilities. Perhaps I wasn't alone, but whoever was here didn't want to be seen. Or worse, perhaps they weren't hiding at all. A sudden, suffocating stillness fell over the church, as if the air itself had thickened. The candle flickered once more, then suddenly went out, plunging the altar into darkness. My breath caught as the last wisp of smoke curled into the air. The absence of the light left an eerie void, making the church feel colder, emptier. I hadn't touched it, hadn't even been close enough to disturb the flame. A whisper drifted through the air, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, my skin erupting in goosebumps. I turned sharply, scanning the dim interior, but the church remained silent. The pews stretched out in endless rows, empty yet filled with an unseen presence. The urge to leave became overwhelming, my body screaming at me to move. I took a step toward the entrance, my legs stiff with tension. Another whisper brushed against my ear, closer this time, almost as if someone stood just behind me. I spun around, my breath hitching, but there was nothing there. The air grew colder, a sharp contrast to the warmth that had once surrounded the candle. My hands trembled as I took another step, my gaze darting around the church. The silence felt suffocating now, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The doorway seemed impossibly far, each step toward it stretching the distance. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the church, though the doors and windows remained closed. It carried the scent of something old, something decayed, a sharp contrast to the fresh wax that had burned moments ago. I broke into a run, no longer caring about composure or logic. Whatever had been here, whatever had lit that candle, did not want me to stay. I burst through the heavy doors, gasping as the cool night air wrapped around me. The weight that had pressed on my chest inside the church lifted instantly. My hands were shaking, my heart still hammering from the overwhelming sense of dread. I turned back, half expecting to see movement within the ruined building. The church stood silent, dark, and undisturbed. The only sign that anything had happened was the lingering scent of wax that clung to my skin. I knew then that I had not been alone in that place, that something had been watching from the shadows. Whether it had been a remnant of the past or something else entirely, I wasn't sure. I walked away quickly, resisting the urge to glance back again. The town had long since forgotten the church, left it to decay with time. But I knew better now. I knew something still lingered there, something that hadn't yet let go. The candle had been a sign, a warning, and I had barely escaped before whatever had lit it decided I should stay. Story 25. The amusement park loomed in the distance, its skeletal rides silhouetted against the overcast sky. Rusted gates stood half open, swaying slightly in the wind, as if inviting me inside. The scent of damp wood and decay lingered in the air, mixing with something faintly sweet, like old popcorn. The silence was thick, pressing against my ears as I stepped past the threshold. The cracked pavement crunched beneath my feet as I made my way deeper into the park. Faded banners clung desperately to their poles, their slogans barely legible through years of neglect. An old carousel stood motionless, its horses frozen mid-gallop, their painted eyes dull and lifeless. Something about the place felt wrong, as if it had been waiting for me. I turned a corner and spotted a small ticket booth nestled between two collapsed game stalls. The glass was clouded with grime and the wood was warped and splintered. Yet on the counter, untouched by dust or decay, sat a single ticket. My pulse quickened as I stepped closer, my eyes locking onto the name printed in bold letters across the paper. It was my name. The date stamped beneath it was today's. My fingers hesitated before picking it up, the paper smooth and crisp as if freshly printed. A chill ran down my spine as I scanned the empty park, searching for any sign of life. No one was there, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had left it for me. I turned the ticket over, half expecting some kind of explanation, but the back was blank. The entrance gates had been open when I arrived, but now they were shut, locked tight with a chain that hadn't been there before. A soft hum filled the air, like distant carnival music drifting from somewhere deep within the park. The sound pulled me forward, leading me past abandoned rides and toppled booths. The Ferris wheel stood motionless, its rusted frame groaning as the wind pushed against it. Faded stuffed animals lay scattered on the ground, their button eyes staring up blankly. Every instinct screamed for me to leave, but my feet kept moving. At the park's center stood a grand theater, its marquee cracked and unreadable. The doors were slightly ajar, a soft golden light spilling from within. My hand tightened around the ticket as I stepped up to the entrance, the scent of old fabric and dust thick in the air. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. Rows of velvet-covered seats stretched out before me, all facing a stage shrouded in darkness. A single spotlight flickered to life, illuminating a podium at the center. The silence was heavy, oppressive, pressing down on my chest. Then, without warning, the speakers crackled to life. "Welcome," a voice announced, smooth and hollow. "We've been waiting for you." My breath hitched as a faint rustling filled the theater, the sound of unseen bodies shifting in their seats. The darkness beyond the spotlight seemed to pulse, something lurking just beyond my vision. A figure stepped into the light, its form eerily familiar. My stomach clenched as I realized I was looking at myself, standing at the podium, staring directly at me. The reflection of my own face smiled, though my lips remained firmly pressed together. "Please, take your seat," it said in my voice. My legs trembled as I hesitated, but the unseen audience stirred again, a low murmur rippling through the air. The other me tilted its head slightly, eyes dark and unreadable. "The show is about to begin," it said, extending an arm toward the empty seats. The ticket in my hand burned cold against my palm. I forced myself forward, lowering into a seat near the back. The cushions sagged beneath me, releasing a puff of dust into the air. As soon as I settled, the lights dimmed, plunging the room into near total darkness. A faint glow flickered across the stage, revealing a massive curtain beginning to rise. The screen behind the podium flickered to life, displaying a grainy image of the amusement park. It was moving, as if filmed from someone's perspective, weaving through the empty pathways I had just walked. My heartbeat thundered as I realized it was following my exact path, down to the moment I picked up the ticket. The scene continued, playing out my journey through the park in real time. But then, something changed. The camera panned slightly, revealing a shadow following just behind me, its form stretching unnaturally against the dim light. My hands clenched the armrests as I fought the urge to turn around. The audience murmured again, a sound like rustling leaves or whispering voices. The figure on the screen crept closer, its movements jagged, unnatural. My reflection at the podium smiled wider, teeth gleaming in the dim light. "It's time," it said, "for the final act." The screen cut to black, and the theater fell into suffocating silence. My breath came in shallow gasps as I gripped the armrests, my knuckles white. Then, directly behind me, a chair creaked as if someone had just sat down. A cold presence pressed against my back, the air thick with something unseen. My reflection on stage turned its head toward me, its grin stretching impossibly wide. "Enjoy the show," it whispered. The lights above flickered, and in that brief flash I saw them rows upon rows of figures, seated in every chair, their faces blank and watching. A strangled gasp caught in my throat as the darkness swallowed them again. I shot to my feet, the ticket slipping from my fingers as I stumbled toward the doors. They wouldn't budge. My breath hitched as I pounded against the wood, my pulse hammering in my ears. The whispers behind me grew louder, overlapping into a chorus of indecipherable voices. Then, the final words came, clear and deafening. "You belong to the park now." The lights shut off completely, plunging me into total darkness. The last thing I felt was cold hands wrapping around my arms, pulling me back into the seats. Story 26. The mansion stood at the edge of town, its once grand facade now cloaked in ivy and decay. The windows were dark, gaping holes, and the front door hung slightly ajar as if waiting for someone to step inside. I had heard the rumors, the stories of strange occurrences, but curiosity outweighed my caution. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of rotting wood and dust. My footsteps echoed in the vast, empty halls, where tattered curtains barely clung to their rods. Faint traces of the past remained, faded portraits, an overturned chair, a broken chandelier resting in the middle of the floor. Moving deeper into the house, I entered what must have once been the main parlor. A massive grandfather clock stood against the far wall, its face frozen at an unknown hour. Its ornate carvings were coated in dust, the pendulum still as death. I stepped closer, drawn by an unexplainable pull, and reached out. My fingers brushed against the wood, and instantly the air shifted around me. The silence shattered as the clock let out a deep, groaning tick, the hand sluggishly beginning to move. A shiver ran down my spine as I watched the second hand twitch to life. It crept forward, slow and deliberate, as if struggling against some unseen force. The minute hand inched toward midnight, each movement making my pulse quicken. The room felt colder, the atmosphere thick with something unseen. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows deepened, stretching unnaturally across the floor. I took a step back, but the moment my foot left the ground, the house itself seemed to exhale. A soft creak sounded from above, followed by the distant rustling of fabric. My breath caught as I turned my gaze toward the grand staircase at the edge of the room. The railing was coated in dust, yet I swore I saw faint handprints trailing along its surface. The clock let out another deep tick, louder this time, echoing through the hollow mansion. My eyes snapped back to its face, where the hands were now eerily close to 12. A wave of unease crawled through me, urging me to step away. Then, from somewhere within the house, a whisper stirred the air. It was faint, almost a breath, yet it sent ice through my veins. My fingers twitched at my sides as I forced myself to stay still, listening for any sign of movement. The whisper came again, closer this time, though I could not make out the words. The clock ticked once more, heavy and deliberate, as the minute hand slid even closer to midnight. I felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing against me, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned sharply, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but the hallway beyond remained empty. My pulse thundered in my ears as I took another step back. The floor beneath me groaned, shifting as if something unseen moved beneath the wooden planks. The clock let out a sudden chime, the sound reverberating through the walls. My body stiffened as the last fragments of dust drifted from the ceiling. The shadows flickered, and for the briefest moment I saw movement just beyond the doorway. Something had changed, something had woken, and I was no longer alone. The air crackled with energy, and the floorboards trembled beneath my feet. The whisper turned into a hushed murmur, a voice threading through the silence. The chime sounded again, long and hollow, sending a tremor through my bones. My eyes locked onto the clock, the hands now seconds away from striking midnight. A cold dread wrapped around my chest as I realized I needed to leave before it was too late. I turned toward the entrance, but the shadows seemed thicker now, shifting unnaturally. My breathing quickened as the whispering grew louder, overlapping voices crawling into my ears. Each tick of the clock felt like a heartbeat, hammering against the walls of time. Another chime rang out, shaking the very foundation of the house. The door, which had been slightly ajar when I entered, now stood sealed shut. Panic clawed at my throat as I lunged forward, yanking at the handle, but it refused to budge. The final tick landed, and the room fell into a suffocating stillness. My pulse pounded as I turned back to the clock, my breath caught in my throat. The hands now pointed directly at midnight, yet the second hand still trembled, hesitating before the final stroke. Then, with an eerie slowness, the pendulum began to swing. The entire house groaned in response, as though it were breathing in unison with the motion. A heavy gust of wind tore through the room, sending dust swirling into the air. The whispering stopped, replaced by the soft shuffle of footsteps. My stomach twisted as I lifted my gaze, my skin prickling with the certainty that something was standing in the doorway. The air grew thick, pressing against my lungs, making it difficult to move. The pendulum swung faster, and with every motion, the figure in the doorway grew more distinct. It was tall, draped in shadows, its form shifting like smoke. My hands clenched into fists as my instincts screamed for me to flee. The chime struck midnight, deafening and final, shaking the walls and sending cracks splintering through the floor. The figure in the doorway moved, stepping forward with slow, deliberate intent. My body locked in place, held by an unseen force as it loomed closer. The clock's hands shuddered violently before snapping back to their original position. A rush of air burst through the room, and suddenly the presence vanished. The door behind me creaked open as if released from an invisible grip. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled backward, my legs weak beneath me. The mansion seemed to settle, the eerie energy dissipating like mist in the wind. I did not hesitate. I bolted through the open door, the cold night air shocking against my skin. The house stood silent behind me, its darkened windows empty once more. My heartbeat thundered as I reached my car, my fingers fumbling with the keys. As the engine roared to life, I stole one last glance at the mansion. The clock still stood in the window, its face faintly illuminated by the moonlight. The hands had moved again, no longer frozen at midnight. They ticked forward, slow and deliberate, counting down to something unseen. Story 27. The entrance to the abandoned zoo was barely visible beneath layers of vines and rusted metal. The gate hung open, its once proud sign faded and illegible, creaking softly in the breeze. Stepping inside, I found cracked pathways swallowed by weeds, enclosures overtaken by nature, and silence thick enough to feel unnatural. Cages lined both sides of the path, their metal bars bent and corroded from years of neglect. Most were empty, their doors ajar as if whatever had once lived inside had long since escaped. A few still contained remnants of their past bones, tattered nests, or feeding trays covered in dirt. The deeper I went, the stronger the sense of unease settled in my chest. Then I saw it. A cage larger than the rest, its bars somehow still intact despite the decay surrounding it. Inside, in the dim light filtering through the trees, the creature sat motionless, its gaze locked onto me the moment I stepped closer. Its body was obscured by shadows, but its eyes, large, reflective, and unnervingly human, stood out against the darkness. A chill crawled up my spine as I moved slightly to the left, then to the right. The eyes followed. No shift in its body, no sound, just those unblinking orbs tracking every move I made. My breath came slow and shallow as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, but the longer I stared, the less it felt like an animal at all. Its form was wrong, shifting in a way that made my mind struggle to process it. The dim light only allowed me glimpses, long limbs folded awkwardly, a body too thin yet impossibly dense, skin that looked both smooth and rough in different moments. My stomach twisted as I realized I could not hear it breathing, nor could I tell if it had ever blinked. I took another step closer, gripping the cold metal bars for support. The second my fingers touched the rusted surface, a low, guttural sound filled the space between us. It wasn't a growl, nor a hiss, but something else entirely, something that seemed to burrow into my bones. The air itself felt heavier, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs remained locked in place. The creature tilted its head slowly, its gaze never wavering. There was an intelligence behind those eyes, something calculating, something patient. I could almost feel it reaching toward me without moving, as if testing the space between us. A sharp crack echoed behind me, shattering the eerie silence. My body jolted, and I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs. A branch had snapped beneath my foot, but the realization came with a more terrifying one. The air had changed, thickening with a metallic scent. When I turned back, the creature was standing. Its limbs unfolded unnaturally, stretching in ways that should have been impossible. The bars of the cage seemed almost insignificant against the sheer presence of it, as if they were never meant to hold it in the first place. My pulse pounded in my ears as I finally noticed something I should have seen before. The cage door was open. Every muscle in my body tensed as the creature took a slow step forward, never breaking eye contact. The space between us shrank with each impossibly graceful movement, as if it was gliding rather than walking. My breath hitched as I tried to will my feet to move, but fear had anchored me in place. The scent in the air grew stronger, thick and cloying, coating my throat with something bitter. My fingers clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms as I forced myself to break the spell of its gaze. The moment I did, a deep, shuddering exhale came from the creature, almost amused. A gust of wind rushed through the trees, rattling the empty cages around us. The sound momentarily snapped me out of my paralysis, and I took a desperate step back. The creature didn't lunge, didn't rush, just watched, waiting, its movements slow and deliberate. It knew I was afraid. The path behind me was uneven, covered in vines and broken stone, but I didn't care. I turned and ran. My footsteps pounded against the cracked pavement, breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed forward. The zoo felt endless now, its twisted remains stretching on forever, every shadow hiding something unseen. A scraping sound echoed from behind, sharp and rhythmic, like claws against stone. I didn't dare look back. My body screamed for me to go faster, lungs burning as I forced my way through the tangled overgrowth. The entrance had to be close. It had to be, yet the path felt unfamiliar, shifting like a maze meant to keep me trapped. The wind howled through the empty structures, carrying with it a whisper of movement too close behind. My vision blurred with panic as I pushed harder, the rusted gate finally appearing in the distance. It looked smaller than before, almost impossibly far, but it was my only way out. A deep, guttural sound rippled through the air, vibrating through my chest. It was closer. Too close. My legs screamed in protest as I threw myself forward, my hands grasping the metal gate just as a rush of movement stirred behind me. Without hesitation, I stumbled through, collapsing onto the dirt beyond. Silence. The zoo stood before me, lifeless and unmoving, the entrance as abandoned as before. My breaths came in harsh gasps, my body shaking violently as I turned my head toward the path. Nothing. No movement, no sound, just the quiet hum of the wind and the distant rustling of leaves. I pushed myself up, legs weak beneath me, and stepped back from the gate. The sun had started to dip lower, casting the ruins in long shadows. The longer I stared, the more I felt something staring back. My chest tightened as I realized something else: the scent had not faded. I took another step back, Then another, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. The zoo had let me leave, but it had not let me go. Somewhere beyond that rusted gate, just out of sight, I knew it was still watching, and it would be waiting. Story 28. The firehouse had been abandoned for years, its red brick walls cracked and covered in ivy. The windows were thick with grime, their panes long shattered by time and weather. The front doors were chained shut, but a side entrance hung slightly ajar, as if someone had forced their way inside. The air was thick with dust and the scent of mildew, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. Stepping through the doorway, I let my eyes adjust to the dim interior. The floor was coated in a thin layer of dirt, undisturbed except for a single trail of footprints leading deeper inside. Near the entrance, a pair of heavy boots sat abandoned, their surfaces caked in dried mud. My breath hitched as I realized the floor around them was otherwise untouched. The boots hadn't been there long, but the firehouse had been locked up for years. A chill crawled up my spine as I crouched down, inspecting them closer. They were old but sturdy, the kind firefighters might have worn decades ago. The laces were still tied, as if someone had stepped right out of them and never returned. The thought unsettled me, but curiosity pushed me forward. I followed the faint footprints leading toward the garage where the fire trucks had once been parked. Rusted lockers lined the walls, their doors hanging open, empty save for a few forgotten belongings. A helmet sat on a bench, covered in dust, yet its visor was free of grime, as if someone had wiped it clean. The garage smelled of oil and stagnant water, the scent of decay woven into every surface. A row of hoses hung on the far wall, brittle and cracked with age. The fire pole stood in the center of the room, its metal dull and rusted, the floor beneath it warped from years of neglect. Something about the space felt off, as if I had stepped into a place frozen in time. A faint creak echoed from above, sending a jolt of unease through me. The second floor had once been the living quarters for the firefighters, their bunks and kitchens still intact but left to rot. I hesitated before making my way to the stairs, my pulse quickening with every step. The wood groaned beneath my weight, each footfall stirring dust into the stale air. The dormitory was lined with beds, their mattresses sagging, their sheets discolored with age. Personal items still littered the shelves, photographs, books, even a coffee mug resting on a nightstand. It was as if the firefighters had simply vanished one night, leaving everything behind. A newspaper sat open on one of the beds, the pages yellowed, but the ink still legible. The date sent a shiver down my spine, June 17, 1986. That was the night of the fire that had supposedly shut this place down. A factory had gone up in flames on the outskirts of town, and the entire crew had responded. The official reports claimed they had evacuated in time, but the firehouse had been closed shortly after, never to reopen. A noise from below made me freeze. It wasn't the wind or the settling of the building, it was deliberate, the sound of something shifting. My breath caught as I turned toward the stairwell, listening. The air had changed, the silence now expectant, as if I was no longer alone. I moved carefully, my steps slow and deliberate as I descended. The garage was just as I had left it, the abandoned boots still sitting by the door. But something had changed. The dust on the floor had been disturbed, a new set of footprints leading toward the back office. I followed them, my heart pounding. The office door was slightly ajar, its hinges rusted but recently moved. Inside, the desk was cluttered with old files, papers scattered as if someone had been searching for something. A locker stood against the wall, its door hanging open, a uniform still hanging inside. The air was colder here, the the scent of damp fabric mixing with something faintly metallic. I reached out, brushing my fingers against the sleeve of the uniform. The material was stiff with age, but the patches were still visible, the name barely readable. The last name sent a chill through me. It belonged to one of the firefighters from that final call. The sudden draft sent the door creaking further open, and I spun toward the sound. The garage was empty, yet the sensation of being watched prickled at my skin. My eyes flicked to the boots, my stomach twisting. They were no longer empty. The laces were untied now, loose as if someone had stepped into them. My breath hitched as I took a slow step back, my pulse thundering in my ears. The air felt thick, charged with something unseen, something lingering. A whisper of movement stirred the dust near the fire pole, an unseen presence shifting just beyond my sight. I didn't wait to find out more. My body moved before my mind could catch up, my feet carrying me toward the exit. The moment I stepped through the doorway, the weight in the air lifted, the silence swallowing the building once more. I turned back only once, my breath misting in the night air. Through the grimy window, a figure stood just inside, barely visible in the dim light. The outline of a firefighter, motionless, watching me. My stomach clenched as I took another step back, my mind racing. The boots had been waiting for someone to return, and I had nearly answered the call. I forced myself to walk away, my footsteps quickening as the firehouse faded into the darkness behind me. The town remained silent, unaware of what still lingered inside that abandoned station. Whatever had been left behind that night in 1986 had never truly left at all. Story 29. The school loomed before me, its windows shattered and its doors hanging loosely on rusted hinges. Vines crawled up the brick walls, their tendrils snaking into the cracks like nature reclaiming what was left behind. The air smelled of mildew and damp wood, the scent of abandonment thick in my nostrils. Stepping inside, my footsteps echoed through the empty halls, the sound unnerving in the heavy silence. Lockers stood ajar, some with their doors bent at unnatural angles, their contents long gone. Faded posters still clung to the walls, their once bright messages now peeling and barely readable. The further I walked, the more unsettling the school became, as if it had been frozen in time. A child's backpack lay in the middle of the hallway, covered in dust, its zippers rusted shut. Desks were overturned in some classrooms, their wooden legs broken, as if something had ended here in a hurry. I stopped at a door marked Room 104, its window cracked but still intact. Pushing it open, I was met with the overwhelming scent of old paper and chalk dust. The classroom looked as if it had been left in a rush, chairs still pulled out, books open on the desks. At the front of the room, the chalkboard was covered in writing, a lesson frozen mid-thought. The handwriting was neat at first, a list of vocabulary words and arithmetic problems written in perfect lines. But toward the bottom, the words became more erratic, the chalk strokes jagged, almost frantic. My eyes landed on the last word scrawled across the board, smeared as if written in haste. It read only one thing: run. The letters were uneven, the pressure of the chalk so heavy that it had crumbled in places. Something about it sent a shiver through me, my instincts telling me to leave. A gust of wind rattled the broken windows, sending a flurry of dust through the air. The sound of something shifting echoed from the hallway, but when I turned, there was nothing there. The silence pressed down again, thick and suffocating, making me suddenly aware of how alone I was. I stepped closer to the board, running my fingers over the chalk, surprised to find it fresh. The powder smudged beneath my touch, the strokes fragile as if someone had written them moments ago. My heart pounded as I turned back to the classroom, scanning the rows of desks, expecting movement. A faint tapping sound came from the hallway, slow and rhythmic, like footsteps approaching. The sound was too precise, too deliberate, each tap echoing longer than it should. My breath caught as I realized it wasn't footsteps, it was the sound of chalk scraping against a board. Spinning back toward the chalkboard, I watched in horror as new words began forming beneath the last message. The chalk moved on its own, scratching out letters in jerky, erratic strokes. I took a step back as the message became clear. Don't look behind you. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to move, but fear rooted me in place. The tapping in the hallway grew louder, no longer slow but urgent, closing in. The air behind me felt different, heavy, as if something stood just beyond my vision, waiting for me to turn. I forced my legs to move, lunging for the door without daring to glance back. My pulse pounded in my ears as I burst into the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The school had changed, the walls seemed closer, the corridor stretching longer than before. Desks and chairs that hadn't been there before now lined the hall, forming a twisted maze. I weaved through them, my hands trembling as I knocked over an old stack of books. A whispering sound followed me, voices too soft to understand but unmistakably there. I reached the main doors, my fingers fumbling against the rusted handle. It wouldn't budge, the lock twisted and fused with time. My pulse thundered as the whispering grew louder, the sound surrounding me, pressing against my skull. A cold breath grazed my neck, sending a violent shudder through me. I slammed my fists against the door, my panic rising as I fought against the unyielding metal. The whispers turned to laughter, soft and mocking, as if they knew I had nowhere to go. I spun around, expecting to see something standing in the darkened corridor. But the hallway was empty, the desks and chairs now gone, the floor bare except for a single sheet of paper. My name was written on it in the same jagged handwriting from the chalkboard. A slow, deliberate creak came from the far end of the hall, a door swinging open on its own. The classroom I had just left stood wide open, its chalkboard now blank. The only sound was the faint scratch of chalk, as if an unseen hand was still writing. I backed away, my pulse racing as the lights flickered overhead. The once dim hallway was now swallowed in deep shadows, shifting unnaturally as if alive. My breath hitched as a figure stepped forward from the darkness, its shape barely human. I didn't wait to see more. I ran, my feet pounding against the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air grew colder with every step, the laughter echoing through the halls, distorting into something inhuman. The walls seemed to close in, the school warping around me. I threw myself against a side door, praying it would open. It gave way with a sickening groan, sending me tumbling outside into the overgrown courtyard. The laughter stopped instantly, the air suddenly still, as if the school itself had exhaled me. I scrambled to my feet, looking back at the broken windows and sagging roof. The school stood silent once more, its presence looming but still. The sense of being watched remained, a weight pressing on my back as I took a shaky step away. As I turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught my eye. In the second floor window, a shadow shifted, its head tilting slightly as if acknowledging me. My stomach clenched as I realized it was standing in room 104, exactly where I had been moments ago. I didn't look back again. I walked away as fast as I could, feeling the weight of unseen eyes follow me until I was far from the school's crumbling walls. The air felt lighter the further I went, but the sound of chalk scratching against a board still lingered in my ears. Story 30. The hospital stood in eerie silence, its windows shattered, the once sterile walls now coated in grime and graffiti. Ivy crept along the crumbling brick, winding its way through cracks and broken doorways. The air smelled of mildew and decay, thick with the weight of abandonment. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled by layers of dust and debris, the empty hall stretching into darkness. Faded signs hung loosely from rusted nails, their words barely legible under years of neglect. Wheelchairs and gurneys sat abandoned, their metal frames rusting, their wheels locked in place by time. A faint breeze whispered through the corridors, carrying the distant sound of something dripping, slow and rhythmic. The walls bore deep scratches, as if someone or something had clawed at them in desperation. The flickering light from my flashlight revealed broken tiles and dark stains smeared across the floor. I followed the signs to the morgue, my pulse quickening with each step into the depths of the hospital. The air grew colder, thick with the sterile scent of forgotten years. The door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing rows of steel drawers built into the walls. The room was silent, save for the distant echo of my breathing, the gurneys covered in dust and long-dried stains. The drawers were mostly closed, their handles rusted, the names on their labels faded beyond recognition. One drawer, however, stood slightly ajar, the darkness inside seeming to breathe. A faint scratching sound came from within, barely audible, yet constant, like nails dragging against metal. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, straining to listen. The noise was deliberate, steady, as if something inside was trying to get out. I stepped closer, my fingers hovering over the handle, my skin prickling with unease. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so thick it felt suffocating. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I reached out, the drawer cold under my fingertips. I hesitated before pulling, the metal groaning as the drawer slid open inch by inch. The stench of rot hit me first, sour and heavy, burning the back of my throat. The beam of my flashlight revealed an empty slab, but the air inside shifted as if something unseen had just moved. I leaned in, scanning the darkness, the silence pressing against my ears. A whisper of movement came from deep within the drawer, something unseen shifting just beyond the reach of my light. My pulse hammered as the scratching resumed, slow and deliberate, from somewhere deep inside. I yanked my hand back, heart racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The drawer remained open, but the shadows inside seemed to pulse, as if something was breathing within them. I staggered backward, the temperature in the room dropping, a deep chill settling into my bones. A metallic clang echoed through the morgue as another drawer shifted, the sound sharp and jarring. My flashlight darted to the movement, but there was nothing there, only stillness. The other drawers sealed shut. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest, suffocating in its weight. A whisper slithered through the silence, just on the edge of hearing, its source unseen. My skin crawled, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs remained frozen. The open drawer gaped at me, the darkness inside feeling impossibly deep. Then, something moved, a brief flicker of motion within the shadows, too fast to be fully seen. The flashlight sputtered, its beam dimming as if the very air around me was swallowing the light. I stepped back, my pulse hammering, the scratching growing louder, more frantic. The sound scraped against my nerves, echoing in the hollow space of the morgue, filling every corner. My mind raced with the impossible, was something trapped inside, something that had never left. A cold breath of air touched my skin, the sensation crawling up my spine like unseen fingers. A sudden crash shattered the silence as a gurney toppled over, its wheels spinning in the dust. The air felt electric, charged with something unseen, something waiting. I stumbled toward the door, my fingers fumbling over the rusted handle, desperate to leave. Just as I pushed it open, the scratching stopped, replaced by something worse. A slow, deliberate creak, like the sound of a drawer sliding open, deeper in the room. I didn't turn to look. I didn't want to see what had freed itself. I ran, my footsteps echoing down the empty hallways, the darkness closing in around me. The hospital felt alive now, the air thick with something watching, something aware. Doors that had been open before were now shut, the way out feeling impossibly far. Reaching the entrance, I burst through the doors, the outside air shocking against my skin. The sky had darkened, the hospital looming behind me, its shattered windows like empty eyes. My chest heaved, my hands shaking as I turned to look one last time. The morgue window was black, the inside swallowed by shadows. But in the silence just before I turned away, I heard it again, faint, distant, but unmistakable. The slow, deliberate sound of scratching, still coming from inside.